Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very, very much for tolerating some of our ADD issues that we have been working through this morning. I would appreciate all of you being here in person, as well as our folks in our Zoom webinar. My name is Laura Bartok. I'm a coalition facilitator for Maryland Climate Partners. I'm so excited to have you all here today for the Maryland Agency's Climate Progress Spring Forum. This is, as many of you know, a second part of a two-part series. In December, we hosted an intro webinar where we were able to hear from our agency partners on the progress implementing the climate reduction plan, as well as their individual climate implementation plans. Today, the goal is really to move from reporting back into having some serious conversations about where our state is in terms of progressing towards our climate goals and what solutions are still ahead of us. So, you've seen this slide for a few minutes now, but I'll still quickly run through this. Today, we encourage you all to listen to understand. We will have the opportunity to ask questions, but we ask that you, rather than listen to respond, listen to understand and hear what our speakers have to say. We also encourage you to take breaks as needed. For folks in the room, you can see the restrooms are behind you and on the stage right. We also have breaks built in throughout the day, so hopefully folks can have that time to get coffee, get hydrated, and take a bite break. We do ask that you silence your phone, and for folks in Zoom, keep your mics muted so that we can have a seamless experience to the degree possible. Again, we have index cards that we will be passing out. These are for our in-the-room folks to write down your questions as our panels occur. We have wonderful moderators who've prepared a series of thoughtful questions, but we also invite you to share your own questions, and we'll do our best to incorporate as many as we possibly can. Similarly, for our folks on Zoom, please use that Q&A pod that we'll be monitoring for your questions as well. We go to the next slide. I'll share just a little bit about Maryland Climate Partners. We are a coalition of 20 different organizations that represent environmental advocates, faith advocates, consumer advocates, and a wide range of advocacy organizations. And we're really focused on ensuring full and equitable implementation of the climate solutions now, including making sure that the climate pollution reduction plan is actually funded, implemented, and executed in a way that brings benefits to all Marylanders. On the right side of the screen, you can see some of our values of our coalition. Of course, first and foremost is prioritizing equitable solutions, and you'll hear more about that during our first panel on equity and reinvestment. We also prioritize authentic representation, so ensuring communities and people who are most directly impacted by climate issues have a voice, have a seat at the table. So we're excited to have a very diverse crowd in the room today and online, sharing your perspectives and questions. And last but not least, we believe in good faith collaboration. So we're excited today to focus on solutions and the ways that we can work together to ensure that we are meeting our climate goals, again, in ways that really deliver meaningful benefits. Next slide, please. A quick overview of our agenda. As you know, Connor is slightly behind, but we're going to endeavor to make some time up. We'll start with our keynote from David Black, Office of People's Counsel, before we dive into our panel on equity and community investment, representing one of Climate Partners' 2026 policy issue priorities. Panel number 2 on climate finance and funding implementation also represents a key priority for the Coalition 2026, as well as buildings and electrification, our post-lunch panel. After our final panel, we will have an interactive discussion in the afternoon. We'll pass out some worksheets and invite you to be in conversation with one another before we bring it all back for some synthesis. With that, I'm going to wrap up my remarks and invite David up to the stage. Thank you all very much.
Morning, everybody, and thank you, Laura. It's great to be here, and I see a lot of familiar faces. thank you very much, Keynote partners and federal agencies, for the opportunity and privilege to speak here this morning. I'm going to talk about utility costs, reliability on the electric system, the importance of how we think about energy policy, and some policy considerations. And we'll see if there's time for questions at the end. I'm going to defer to Laura on that. So I wanted to start by highlighting a great book. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Many of you may know the book, and if you don't, I highly recommend it. Kahneman won the Pulitzer Prize for Economics, and his book talks about how we think using System 1 and System 2. System 1 is automatic and quick, and System 2 requires effort. One aspect of System 1 thinking is that what you see is all there is. And that means our tendency to ignore the possibility that critical evidence is missing, and to treat the information that we have as if it was all there is to know. System 1 gets us into trouble. And as I talk this morning, I'm going to highlight how System 2 thinking is critical and how important it is to avoid System 1 thinking when we think about utility and energy policy. Energy policy impacts tens and even hundreds of billions of dollars, and powerful corporate players would like people to use System 1 thinking to arrive at results that advance their rent-seeking interests. But the devil is in the details and requires System 2 thinking. So if you could turn to the next slide. What I want to talk about starting out is what's behind your energy bill. System 2 thinking is especially critical to understanding the causes of high energy bills. Utility bills have several different components, and each component requires different policies and impacts different actors. So it's important to be precise about what component of the bill you're trying to impact with policies. And of course, customers at the end of the day only see one total bill, and that bill is what impacts affordability in general. And affordability, of course, is a relative concept. It's a factor of extreme and growing inequality of income and wealth in this country that depends on the entire set of costs that households regularly face: utility bills, groceries, transportation, medical care, among others. But for purposes of policymaking, it's critical to understand the makeup of the bill. Next slide. And this slide shows a gas utility bill for Baltimore Gas and Electric. And we can see how gas utility bills for BGE have grown and the components have changed over time. If we just looked at the total bill using System 1 thinking, it would tell us that a customer's cost of gas service in 2008 was about the same as it was in 2024. And in fact, that's what BGE told legislators in 2024 to argue against reforms intended to address accelerated cost recovery for gas infrastructure. But here we can see that the cost of gas delivery in 2024 makes up about 2/3 of the bill, while the supply costs 1/3. And we can see how supply costs go up and down, but the distribution cost constantly rises without coming back down, and it's more than tripled since 2008. And it removes any cushion that customers may have to absorb the fluctuating supply costs. What's also important for policymaking purposes is that the supply cost is something that state policy has little control over, while distribution costs are state regulated and how the utilities earn their profits. Our biggest gas utilities today continue to spend at an accelerated pace on gas infrastructure at a rate of $750 million a year. Those costs go into the distribution rates where they remain for decades into the future. System 2 thinking means being aware about the two things that are not on this slide as well. And the first is the fact that gas utility spending is continuing at the same pace. So distribution costs will continue to increase, impacting customers, unless the state exercises its regulatory authority to curb that spending. Secondly, is that the high and growing cost of gas utility service are a unique challenge for customers separate from electric service that dominates much of the policy discussion. Next slide, please. You'll see here that electric bills are more complicated than gas bills. This is a breakdown of the bill components from an average Pepco customer over the last 10 years. It shows the four major categories of cost. The top three portions are federally jurisdictional, while the bottom portion is state jurisdictional. And that means that the state has limited ability to control the top three sets of costs and much greater control over the orange at the bottom. The biggest component is energy, shown in gray at the top. Energy costs are set in competitive markets through our regional organization, PJM, through day-ahead and real-time markets. And energy costs depend largely on the cost of producing electricity with a gas-generating unit. And therefore, the variation in price is driven largely by the commodity price of gas. More wind, solar, and storage on the system over time will certainly lessen the impact of the price of gas on energy costs, but the state has little influence in the near term over those costs. Going down, the dark blue section are the capacity costs that have received lots of attention recently. Those costs were set in PJM capacity market auctions, which are intended to ensure the system can meet future reliability needs. The auction is supposed to be held 3 years in advance, but more recently, they've been held much closer in time to the delivery. And what's grabbed attention is the 800% increase in the auction that was held in July of 2024. And you can see that on the far right reflected in the 2025 dark blue price. And compare that to the corresponding blue section for 2024. The 2024 price was at a 10-year low point. So using System 2 thinking, let's compare 2025 to 2015. And the relative increase is substantially smaller. It's about 37%. That doesn't mean that the 2024 to 2025 increase isn't important. It is important, but it puts the recent increase into perspective. And there are lots of reasons for that 2025 increase. They're too much to cover here. But an important takeaway is that the capacity and energy market prices go up and down. And that means that in terms of policy making, we need to take care about making long-term commitments based on responses to what may be temporary fluctuations in price. Looking down to the light blue and transmission costs, utilities describe them to legislators this session as small. But if we look and using System 2 thinking, we can see that transmission costs here are more than capacity market costs. And looking at the data across the 10 years, we can see that like distribution costs, they are only going up and have more than doubled in the last 10 years. Unfortunately, these increasing transmission costs do not reflect a good transmission plan. They're impacted significantly by supplemental or local projects that are not part of regional planning. Those projects are identified and developed by utilities. They avoid competition, and they're not subject to any meaningful cost review, and they increase utility profits. Finally, at the bottom in orange, we can see how escalating distribution costs are driving up the average Pepco customer electric bill. We can see that they've substantially increased. The data show that they've gone from around $441 in 2015 to $776 in 2025, an increase of $355, far exceeding the rate of inflation. Just like gas companies, electric utilities profit from spending more on distribution infrastructure. Rates are rising just a little year by year, but significantly over time. And we know if the utilities continue to spend at the levels they project for their investors, distribution rates will continue to rise. And most of this distribution spending is on traditional utility infrastructure, not driven by state climate policy goals, such as distributed energy resources. I'm going to make two final points about this slide and about percentages. Percentages require system two thinking. First, the top two parts of each bar, energy and capacity, go up and down and may vary by a very high percentage year to year. Transmission and distribution costs don't vary as much year to year, but they're steadily rising. And that means they impact customers, but don't show up as a large percentage from one year to the next. Second, percentages can be misleading. For example, today's gas distribution rates for BGE are double Washington Gas distribution rates. So a 5-cent increase in both of their distribution costs means a 5% increase for Washington Gas and a 10% increase for Washington Gas. So the use of the percentages makes the same rate increase look more significant for the utility with lower costs. The bottom line is that when you see percentages, it's important to use system two thinking to understand what they purport to show. We're going to turn now to electric system reliability. So next slide, thank you. Using system two thinking is also very important for understanding system reliability. And reliability can mean different things. Maryland utilities perform really well on traditional metrics for reliability. That's outages and outage durations when there are no weather-related events. But I'm going to focus on the overall system, and in particular, the question of the supply-demand issue that has been dominating much of the discussion in the state. This issue concerns resource adequacy, which means having enough generation to serve the peak demand, plus a reserve margin, along with the ability of the transmission system to deliver power to customers within a given area. System one thinking tells you that we have a supply-demand issue and leaves it at that. What you see is all there is. System two thinking is necessary to better understand the challenges and evaluate solutions. A common error, system one error, is the conclusion that Maryland has a reliability problem simply because Maryland imports about 40% of its energy over a given year. Yeah, this slide, thank you. But import levels are not reliability measurements. As this slide shows, Maryland has always been, long been, I think it's always, an importer of energy without reliability impacts. Imports measure where the megawatt hours that are consumed in Maryland over the course of a year come from. Reliability is measured in megawatts, not megawatt hours. Reliability means meeting peak demand at the hours of the year where we consume the most energy. And in fact, Maryland is capable of producing much more than 60% of its megawatt hours within the state, but this would come at a cost. In its energy markets, PJM dispatches the most economic power at any given moment, regardless of the location, and that saves customers money. In fact, most states in PJM are net importers, and DC, the District of Columbia, imports almost 100% of its consumption. Next slide. This slide shows how 60% is generated in the state and how that's just an average over the course of the year. And it shows that there are times when Maryland actually generates 100% of its energy needs within the state, as you can see in the upper left corner of the figure. Next slide. This slide has data showing PJM's most recent demand forecast for the Maryland Exelon utilities. Those forecasts show decreases in demand between now and 2029. The bottom table shows their forecast decrease in PJM's 2026 forecast compared to the 2025 forecast. It's a little bit covered up there in the corner, but in 2029, you can see on this chart that BGE's forecast from 2026 is almost 200 megawatts less than PJM's forecast from 2025. I think that's a minus 193. I think it's a 3 that's hidden there. So I want to turn now to the contrast this with the next. Let's look at BGE. This is a slide. Yeah, next slide. Thank you. This is most of this is directly from PJM, and this shows BGE's peak demand over the next 20 years. What you can see here is that BGE's peak demand 20 years from now, in 2046, will be less than its peak demand was in 2011. In other words, PJM projects very modest growth in demand over the next 20 years for BGE. All this tells us that the latest projections from PJM do not evidence significant increases in energy demand in critical parts of Maryland that would create reliability problems. That could change in the future with data centers, which is why data center regulation is so important. And I'll get to that more in a minute. So contrast this slide with the next slide. And this shows demand growth across PJM. And this slide reflects massive projected data center growth. PJM's latest forecast shown here projects about 87,000 megawatts of data center growth impacting the region in 2046. That's the equivalent of adding about 7 states of Maryland just in data centers to PJM. Outside of data center growth, PJM projects only about 6,000 megawatts of demand growth. This scale of demand growth is unprecedented, a paradigm shift in the past. The federal and state systems of utility regulation both are premised on diffuse and gradual growth in demand. Utility regulation has developed over more than 100 years, a product of laws and court decisions. And it assumes that demand grows roughly the same across broad geographical areas and grows gradually. Maryland's own demands have grown over the course of more than 100 years. Data centers, again, break that paradigm. They're concentrated in specific locations and are massive. That's shown in the next slide. This figure shows projections. I'm sorry, I think it's the previous one. Next one. It's not.
There we go.
There we go. So this shows PJM's projections out to 2046, which almost all of the growth of data centers occurring in Virginia, Ohio, and slightly lesser amounts in Illinois and Pennsylvania. Closer in time, in just about 5 years, Virginia alone will add about the same amount of growth from data centers as the entire state of Maryland's peak demand. In utility regulation, we have a critical principle. It's called cost causation. And that means that those entities that are driving higher costs are supposed to be responsible for paying those costs. So far, with data centers, those principles are in jeopardy. PJM's independent market monitor estimates that data centers have driven up the cost of the last 3 capacity market auctions by $23 billion. Over the past 3 years, PJM has approved regional transmission projects, socializing costs associated with them in $24 billion. Primarily for all these projects are primarily for data centers. And while the costs are harder to quantify, data centers are also driving up energy costs. Though they consume massive amounts of energy, and those energy costs were the gray bar in one of the first charts I showed with Pepco. Fortunately, and hopefully, Numerous efforts are underway at the state and federal levels to require data centers to pay for all the costs they're causing. This is a tough battle because laws and regulations have been created for a different paradigm and the profit stakes are really high. Our office and many others are working hard for the many changes that are needed. System 2 thinking informs this supply-demand issue. It's not a Maryland-specific issue, but rather a PJM data center issue. Because of that, Maryland customers should not be on the hook for solving what is a PJM issue resulting from the rapid deployment of city-sized data centers. What's needed is for Maryland and PJM to update utility regulation so that data centers are responsible for every penny of added costs they create. The solution should not be having Maryland customers subsidizing data centers. Equally important, System 2 thinking tells us that Maryland customers cannot practically resolve the PJM data center issue. New gas-fired generation is often discussed as the solution, sometimes with ratepayers taking on the risk of paying for it. Aside from the fact that it would take 5 to 10 years to build 1,000 or 1,500 megawatt gas plant, the cost of such a plant would be significant, well over $2 billion. And that would drive up customer bills even higher than they are today. And what would that accomplish? PJM is projecting more than 80,000 megawatts of data center load growth. 1,000 or 1,500 megawatt gas plant would not meaningfully impact PJM's supply-demand issue. Instead, we need policies to address the data center. Next slide, please. So I'm going to close by briefly mentioning some policy considerations and the importance of an all-in state effort to address Maryland's energy situation. That means rising utility bill burdens for customers, the regional supply and demand issue caused by data centers, and advancing the state's climate goals. System 2 thinking tells us that we should focus as much on mitigating future increases in energy costs from business as usual as we do on ideas for cost cutting, especially where those increasing costs are the result of a lack of planning or poor planning and locking in large uncertain investments. Reducing gas infrastructure spending is a prime example. Gas system planning is critical to mitigating growing gas utility bills. We should eliminate policies that drive higher distribution rates for both gas and electric service. That means ending Maryland's STRIDE program and rate making based on forecast and test period, the latter of which the legislature made some headway this past session. We also have an urgent regulatory task to modernize utility regulations for data centers. And that's something that all stakeholders should get behind. But the data center issue should not be a reason to slow down efforts to electrify buildings, add resiliency, and advance Maryland's climate goals. Compared to data centers, policies to advance building electrification have a very small impact on the electric system. Highly efficient electric technologies can save customers money, especially over the long term, while improving health, safety, and advancing the state's climate policies. State agencies have an important role in promoting building electrification. Our office has advocated for statewide strategic planning to establish an overall framework for electric heat pump market transformation. That would involve many of the state agencies that you'll hear from today. And it would help the Public Service Commission align Empower programs with the programs and policies of agencies like MEA, MDE, DHCD, and the Building Codes Administration. Empower funding through rates is regressive, so other funding mechanisms are critical, as well as programs that support electrification, energy efficiency, and healthy homes, in particular for low-income households. On the supply side, Maryland has a number of important policy initiatives that will reduce PJM's dependence on PJM and build resistance. Distribution and transmission level initiatives to support energy storage, community and rooftop solar, now portable solar, the dry-back, demand response, beautiful, the grid, among others. So I've shared a lot of sort of some of it depressing content. So to wrap up, I wanted to quickly show a couple slides that show promise and realization of progress. This first one is PJM's capacity queue for Maryland. This is from, this was just released a week or two ago. And you can see that there's over 5,000 megawatts of generation projects in Maryland or DC, I think. Almost all of it is in Maryland. And it's primarily battery, solar, and hybrid. And last week I saw on the news that battery storage costs declined 27% in 2025 and are expected to continue to decline going forward. That's good news. This final figure shows data that we pulled from PJM, and it shows large increases in solar capacity in PJM. So the orange at the bottom is 2023, and the blue is 2025, 2 years later. You can see that it more than doubled. And energy produced by solar also increased significantly from 9.6 million megawatt hours to 25 million over that time period by 150%, 157%, I should say. So that's I wanted to finish on some good news. That's what I have. I don't know if there's time for questions, but again, I really appreciate the opportunity and the work that you all are doing.
Currently, no one, I think. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions at this moment, but we would like to bring up our first panel. We will be doing slight arrange rearrange here on the stage to get set up for that, and then we will begin. If anybody does not have the index cards for questions, feel free to come grab some from me or the table back. Beautiful, everybody watching. Good morning. Everybody, there's free coffee. I said good morning. Excellent, excellent. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Rebecca Rear. I'm the Director of Climate Policy and Justice at the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. We're a member of Climate Partners. I serve on the steering committee. I'm excited to be here this morning. Welcome people online. Hi to everybody in person. And I want to start off with some questions for you all, which is who's here because you work on climate change as part of your daily job? Okay. I mean, it's a Climate Partners Forum, so it probably makes sense, right? Do we get people online to raise their hands, or do we get our folks online because they work on climate change? Yeah, excellent. Okay. Who's here because you care about climate change? So you work, okay, good overlap between work on it and care about it. That's good. And then who had a conversation about climate change over the last 2 weeks outside of the office? Okay, you're doing better than most people, because I'm here to tell you that one of the most important things you can do about climate change is talk about it. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your family, talk to that uncle who is going to be more challenging, and have the conversations. And so I'm so excited to be here today having a conversation about climate change and what the state is doing about climate change. This panel is going to be focused on equity and community investment. And so also excited, so the other thing, because I'm the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, the other really important thing you can do about climate change is this is a free event, but is vote. And when we need climate champions in office. And so
I like to start with the punchline because some of you all will tune out at some point. So I like to start where I want to finish. So I'm really excited to be here. Joined to talk about equity and community investment with two people who could not be more qualified to talk about this subject. Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice, Anita Atkinson here at the member from the American and Assistant Secretary for Just Communities, Kat Rubenauer at THC. Welcome. Thank you for the So I was thinking about framing this equity and community investment around, are people familiar with the Rosebud and Thorn approach to strategic planning? I got some thumbs up, some head nods, folks online, Rosebud, Thorn. So this is the idea that there are things that are going really well. Roses are beautiful, they're blooming. There are things that have potential, so some buds, maybe they need some watering, maybe they need some organic compost from our banana fields that we toss, and maybe there's some thorns. Roses are pretty, but if you just go grab one, it's gonna hurt. And so maybe there's some things that are getting more. And so let's keep that in mind as we think about the work that your agencies are doing on equity and community investment. So first question about what is working well? What tools, and I know you're both developing have been developing important tools. What tools do you have that are working well to focus on environmental justice and community?
Pat gave you the mic, you wish you had it first. Good morning, everyone. All here. Hello? Is that better? Okay. Let me know if I trail off. I have a tendency to do that. But good morning again, Anita Atkinson. Some things that are working well. You'll be surprised, or maybe I'm surprised, that I've been in this role for 2 years and 4 months, which is a short amount of time, but went really fast, but also seems like, you have that thought of you're still not doing enough in that time frame. What's going well? My office was created. I held this first position at the agency in the seat. So that showed that Maryland was called in, and they put my role among the highest offices within the agency. So I am the secretary's office, which means I get to be making decisions and around other folks that make decisions that drive policy within our agency and across the state. And I think to date that's going well. At least that's what my observations have said from my bosses. The other thing is working on the environmental justice screening tool, or in the environmental screen. That was one of the first activities that I took on when I came into this role, and it was released last year in 2025. But what was apropos to this conversation is that we added the climate vulnerability score to that tool. I always tell folks that the tool we had it before, and then the rebranding and relaunch of it was to make it more user friendly. So not only us who are used to use this tool or directed by law to have to use it can understand it and solve, get the permits for their clients, how to use it, but the community also how to use it. So we made it very, very intuitive, very user friendly. We even had different sessions where different stakeholders got to engage with the tool and give feedback before it even launched. So a lot of that was built around community in the first place. But the one thing about the tool that I always say is great is I always remember it. But I do remember they did exhibit this in the Congress Library, where they talk about how photography changed the course of the civil rights movement. Because people who didn't know what was happening or hadn't seen, things that were happening to certain communities got to see it. The photographers went down and they started putting pictures in newspapers and bringing back films to people that they made changes. And I compare a lot of the tools that we're working on now to that change. A lot of the overburdened impacts that communities have felt for so long were anecdotal to them and to their family, to their generation, to their experiences of the tools that we're creating today and those that predated it, that all suddenly disappeared. Also does that for communities they are seeing now, and we now can make decisions and changes based on things going forward. I'll stop.
Thank you, Anika. Good morning, everyone. I passed the mic to Anika because the work of the empty and virus screen is very important to the efforts that I'm leading at the HCD, the Just Communities Act implementation process. And also it aligns multiple efforts that are happening at the state level, which I think is very important. I've also been in my role 2 years, 4 months. Anika and I have been fast and furiously working on our work. Just Communities doesn't necessarily focus on climate justice or environmental justice. It focuses on all kinds of justice. So righting the wrongs of the past is the purpose of the Just Communities Act legislation. And to do that, we have to look at historic fact patterns of development in the state of Maryland to understand who is furthest from justice, how do we leverage all of these amazing tools that are being built to identify the data that can help us do data-driven decision making, to identify who is underserved, overburdened, not just today, but historically as well, and where the state has acted or has not acted through investment for those communities. So we are on a bit of an archaeological process. Excited for all the energy and inspiration coming from multiple sister agencies, helping us to identify what happened, when, where, and to whom. So those larger questions for us do require research and data to evaluate all of the census tracts in the state of Maryland, looking at where development has happened, but also looking more statewide at where development has not happened. So we have this amazing and awesome opportunity to balance where investment has gone, to think about reparative capital, but also to look at where investment has not gone, and thinking about how do we look at multiple incentive layers, the way status quo or business as usual has happened, and how do we think of a new way of working across all of the strains.
Thank you both. I'm so glad we started with the mapping tools because one thing about the Climate Solutions Now Act that passed in 2022 is that the headline for that bill is always, well, it's it puts us on the path for our emissions reductions for the state of Maryland. We have our goals, 60% by 2031, and for net zero by 2045. But what that bill also has in it were definitions of overburdened and underserved. And those have been critical to have those definitions codified in law, because for years, the state was stymied on progress with criminal justice because opposition to that concept, opposition to making progress, would say, what do you mean by that? What do you really mean? What are you talking about? And so by codifying definitions for overburdened and underserved, it takes away that what do you mean, because there are legal definitions for a community that is underserved and a community that is overburdened. And now those definitions are the basis for these mapping tools. And one of the main goals there, first of all, it roots the state's climate law in environmental justice, so that we're doing climate work through an equity lens. And it also was meant to help the state focus resources where they're most needed, where there's the highest return on investment. And we see that in the state's climate pollution reduction plan, the hundreds of millions of dollars in health benefits that we're anticipated to see if we achieve all the policies to meet those emissions reductions will be seen in most acutely in overburdened underserved. And so these mapping tools help us realize all that. So could you just talk a little bit more about how those tools have helped with investments? And you started to touch on that. I wrote down the chair for reparative capital because I haven't heard. I love being on a panel and learning some of the time. And so can you just talk a little bit more about how those definitions, how these mapping tools have helped guide investments as money is tight, if I'm being diplomatic? I'll pick up on that and pass it to Nika. The definitions have been very, very important for the work of just communities, having those codified. Who is underserved, who is overburdened, who is vulnerable, and where are those communities located is very helpful. Being able to generate a report with an environmental justice score allows us to have the legitimacy to actually target our resources. So thinking about return on an investment, being wealth building and well-being is what Just Communities is focused on. Outcomes such as economic health and racial equity outcomes are the mandated in that work. And so we had to start with getting our house in order, as I like to say. How do we use data? How have we historically used data? Are our systems and software equipped to do a data-driven decision-making process, doing comparative analysis year on year? How do we evaluate our existing programs and understand where they have done amazing work to transform communities, and then where is uptake a little bit less, and does that overlap with Just Community census tracts, or is there something that we can see through the Enviro screen that can allow us to do more targeted outreach, not just to engage communities, but hopefully to see an equitable distribution of resources through those first ready, first served programs that DHCD offers, which is limited in number. We don't do as much direct to client investment. We generally are funding nonprofits and local governments. So also thinking about what kind of information can we bring to those partners to ensure that we are creating that data feedback that allows us to then continue to refine and target over the next 5 years. So this first designation that was announced by the governor on June 19, 2025 lasts for 5 years. Throughout that process, we will be revising and refining using data and other existing tools. But we are currently administering about 30 of our existing programs through bonus point process that does give advantage to certain communities as long as they qualify overall for our investments.
No? Okay. Thank you for that, Ed. And that is certainly how we are postured. I think as being very unique. We've been engaging with the federal government, particularly EPA, for a long time on the principles around Justice 40, environmental justice parameters, which had allowed us to get internally understanding how our process worked and where our funding was going. If you went to the EPA landing page today, just put EPA landing page to Google it, and the pop up, and you'll see our spending for fiscal year 2024 and how that aligns with the definitions of overburdened and underserved within our communities in Maryland, but also the federal definition of, I don't even know the term is anymore in this administration, but the term that used to be used by the federal government as we talk about our spending. So that is one thing that we have continuously looked at, and we've seen that over the years, MPP has overshot that 40% requirement that we have always been looking for. But that also doesn't mean that we're doing everything right? We don't know what we don't know. If you don't ask the question, then what answer are you looking for? So a lot of the work that I've been doing internally, similar to what Kat said, that internal work is understanding, well, we do permitting, but we also give funding that allows for environmental benefit. And environmental justice, when you think about it, it's not only protection from harm's environment, it's also you get access to the benefit of the environment. So that's where the equity doesn't stand, right? Environmental justice communities are overburdened with the bad and get a lot less of the environment. Since we are in a place where we people, what I have been looking at is, well, where are all of our restoration projects that we are funding? And then, we start looking at that and we're like, well, they go to certain places, right? And we're not seeing them in these communities at the same rate. How do we change that? And now we have regulations out, our stormwater and our wetland mitigation regulations, which incorporate a component that allows for projects in areas which were traditionally not allowed or really, really hard to justify. So that's a change that we're looking at in our process. When we started overlaying our internal mapping with our own screening tool, we started to see gaps that were unveiling. And the question becomes, well, how do we start closing those gaps? The other thing that we've been doing is working with localities, the the tool has allowed not only us, as I said before, but communities, local government to utilize it. Some local governments are utilizing it, and they're overlaying their benefit packages over to communities over our layers and realizing that they too have gaps. So we've been able to work with some of those entities to get the money through mechanisms that we have that allow for funding to go to local governments to do different projects. So we've been utilizing it in that way to try to help fill the gaps that we're seeing. And it kind of goes on and on. The other thing is that we look at who's getting the funding in this work. Who are we giving funding? Are there leaders or people who never engaged with us to get funding, and why or why not, and what's the largest demographic that they represent? And if there's a disparity that is seen there, then me and my team can go out and say, hey, who told you that? Why are you not coming? I know that you have this in your backyard that needs this service. Why are you not coming to us and getting this funding? I haven't seen you on a document 10 years, a decade. And we talk about it. If it's a burden because we did it 10 years ago and it was a hurdle administrative to get done and nobody didn't get the funding. I'm never gonna do that again. And then I said, I can do something with that. And then we work backwards to figure out, okay, how do we eliminate these burdens so that we know money and funding is getting to the communities that we intended to going forward. So those are some examples of the work that we're doing.
I want to sort of build from there and ask about public participation. And I love, thinking about return on investment as wealth building and well-being. And I think that's such an important framework. My background is public health, so it really resonates about that we're looking at wealth building and well-being as how we frame our return on in financials. So I appreciate that. And so, but if you started to talk a little bit about reaching out to folks and making sure that it's not just on paper, but in reality, the sort of investments are made into the people that the money is intended for. And so how do you, the key tenets of environmental justice are fair treatment and meaningful involvement. And that meaningful involvement piece is critical for exactly what you said. So can you just talk a little bit about how through your offices, through the work that you're doing, you are talking about meaningful engagement, so public participation. How does public participation inform your work?
Public participation is my work at the end of the day, and I get excited about it, right? Not only am I in love with water, background in water resources, environmental engineering, but I also love civics. Like I love how we interact with our government, and I want to get other people excited about that, even though they look at me like I'm crazy sometimes. But I do because I think it's a lost art of understanding how government informs every aspect of our lives. And sometimes, some might say we got it so good after it so bad, it got so good and kind of got. But what I want to do is engage people in that process all the time. So how do I do that? One, anytime that there's a program in an area that we know is going to impact the community or could be benefit of the community, we evaluate that. And my team, we go out and try to then talk to that community and say, hey, this thing is here, or this permit is coming, or this funding is coming and it's intended for you. How do you help? How can I help? Right? So that is what my team is doing. But also, when a permittee or an applicant is coming to us and they're saying, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z here at EGA, my first question is who do you know in that community? Just off the bat. You'd be surprised as the responses that we get. Typically, they may know some decision makers, but the actual community which they're impacting, a lot of folks will look at me and be like, what do you want me to do? What do you mean that you know that? And I always say, well, if you were building something in my backyard, or you might be neighbor, it might be nice to meet you. It might be nice to say hi, you can walk past you, at least wave, right? So then you start having those conversations. And I've had very successful meetings with different applicants and permittees around like how do you develop a plan where you're going to engage with the community, where you intend to be a neighbor, or you're already there. Maybe you've never talked to them, but now you want to do something that may impact them. What conversations do you have? And to that end, I've had a lot of those conversations, which I think have been very successful. Encouraging them to talk to community, having coffee and chats and town halls about the work they want to do, and education about permits that they're going to have. So what I did is took all of that lessons learned and just my background and developed the guidance that is currently out for public comment. The public comment period ends May 4th, which is outreach guidance for applicants. And it can be used in many other costs and facets, but it's really intended for your permittee that's coming in for, a renewal or something like that, or if you're coming in for a new project of how you should engage with the community around where you're going to be citing this project. And one of the cool things is it hasn't been implemented, but I've been implementing it in practice with some examples. And I was working with one company, and we're near the end of their permit being finalized. And I said, "How was this experience for you?" And they said, "And you're an international company," and they said, "This was great. Like, you taught us so much. We're actually changing our internal setup so that we have a community engagement base. Like before, it was all over the company. We pulled it all under this one umbrella. We walked through everything that you could utilize in as best practices. And what we could say that this was very, very helpful throughout that process." And I asked the community to see question, like, did you get what you needed out of this process? Notwithstanding like legal things, certain laws that we can't undo, but did you get what you need? And I got the same response from folks of like, yes, this was, they were there, they answered questions, you guys were engaging. So the point of that, one is to give people
To make sure people are still waiting.
yes, so make sure people understand that you are part of community. If you're going somewhere, you're part of community. How do you talk to people? We might not like to do it, but here are some best practices and how we move forward. And the one thing that the company left me with is that we were working on this project with you and your team here at UDA that had a lot of community concern and engagement, and we were working with this other one over here. That one over here is a mess. This one here, we were able to get through that process very well, and we're going to take this and institutionalize it across our organization. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that guidance, please take a look, offer your feedback, and it'll be finalized shortly.
Always a tough act to follow. We are learning a lot from MDE's process. I think it might be a little more agile than DHCD. And what I just want to say about that is we have the Office of Statewide Broadband, we have the state's energy programs, also with the Department of Energy, we have homeless solutions. So we administer homeless funding to continuum of care action agencies across the state. We do multifamily LIHTC deals. We have single family Maryland mortgage programs. We do the state's MPW or small business development funding, and we generally do policy and compliance. I say all of that to say, our ability to turn on a dime is a little bit limited in trying to organize interdivisional approaches to how do we do this in a coordinated effort. So in this year, we just launched with sister agencies what I'm calling the people-centered place-taking approach. And that is bringing out what we've been working on internally, the data-driven piece, the program evaluation, understanding where uptake is good, thinking about this through asset-based community development lens, what are the strengths, and then thinking about some of the newer components of DHC that are being built out. So we just now have an Office of Community Engagement. What I'm clear about is outreach is different than engagement, it's different than involvement. So we're also waiting for this HUD program. Some of you might have seen that we were selected in 2024 to do a community involvement strategic plan and toolkit. In lieu of those funds coming through as timely as we would like, we have still been building out this methodology. So you can look at the Just Communities Viewer online. It has the ability to drop in an address, to look at the 9 factors we were able to find that composed our data-driven process. Spoiler alert, we were not able to identify yet racially exclusionary zoning. Thinking about urban renewal, eminent domain, and demolition using state or federal funds. So we are still building out how this can target these historic practices. The other thing for us is doing institutional reform,
thinking about that system change piece. We are each a system, each sister agency, but then thinking about how do we partner in a way that is impactful to start bringing in those insights. So working with the Department of Environment, Department of Planning, Department of Natural Resources, folks who are a little bit closer to the ground. Our stakeholders, as I said, are usually developers or local governments or community development organizations. So I think that Just Communities has a unique opportunity based on conversations we've had by community members who do or do not see themselves in the mapper, who have some of these fact patterns that we have not yet identified, being kind of a clearinghouse or a warehouse, a way to bring in this information by working with universities to do design charrettes. How do communities take this very painful information about environmental disparities, health and longevity issues, economic issues, social injustices, and think about turning that into a powerful planning document that can be integrated into comprehensive planning, master planning, ways that their inputs can be codified and addressed over time, not just by DHCD, but also other sister agencies. So we are building while we are flying and driving and all the other modes of transportation, but we will be announcing the launch of a story map, also to create a much clearer way to understand the health and wealth implications of this work. All of this is set to go out near the governor's 1-year anniversary. So look for future updates June of 2026, I guess next month.
And I heard, I'm an advocate, so we always have our ask. I heard comment on the public comment on the public comment guidance, right? Or public participation guidance. So that's due May 4th. And believe it or not, May 6th this. And so that's soon. So just make sure you take a look at those, because those are the public participation guidance that NDE gives to industry on how they conduct public participation when doing permits and other requesting things from the agency. So right now, the public has an opportunity to comment on how NDE should interact with agency in the permit process. So it's a pretty good ask. And I encourage you all to take a look. I actually opened the document, ready to be overwhelmed. It's not like crazy long, so it's manageable. And I recommend everybody take a look at that and make comments. So, okay, so I heard a lot. I heard some things about what's going well. I heard some buzz in there too about things that are starting or that are coming soon and we're excited about. And if you all have questions, please get them on the index cards and we'll get to them right after this question, which is we're going to talk about the thorns now. So is there an obstacle, or maybe there's probably some obstacles, but is there one you'd like to share? Have there been obstacles in trying to do this work? What do you see as the greatest obstacle? And is there something that climate projects as well?
So I always, people ask me this question, especially with the current climate. And I always say how fortunate I am to be in this role and in this state. And I'm not saying that for job security or something like that, because I deal with others across the country who either had roles very similar to mine, who no longer existed, they're just gone, or have been stripped of all power that they had before to make any significant change. And I meet with these folks all the time. And, we were meeting before, and then, now, after where we are with the federal government. So I am fortunate to do the work here in Maryland. I have the backing of the best leadership. And I'll keep saying that until something else changes my mind. So what's the thorn? I think I gave it away, right? The thorn that I'm dealing with right now is the federal government. This current administration, my role would not exist, should not exist under their new executive orders and policies that they are currently promoting, which makes it really, really hard to do your job when you have to look at, the White House website every other day to see what new thing is being attacked and it's not DEI, environmental justice, climate initiatives, states' rights, it's a constant thorn. And for this strategic movement and involvement with other state agencies to be so young and fragile, it also hurts that process, right? We brought in communities through this process over the last 15, 25 years that were never engaged with government in any level because of the past wrongs, the uncertainty, the list goes on and on. And we worked really, really hard to engage them and said, we got you now, right? We're going to be working really hard. We're going to, really be here. We're going to be present. We got money to back us. We got support at the state level. We got a federal level. We got a local level. We did a lot of work in that arena, and then the rug was kind of pulled out from, we say us, but it's from them. If you can imagine, saying, okay, I'll come to the table, and I'll do that with the issues that I have to deal with every day in life. They'll come and be present and participate in this terrain or participate in this process, so I can be there even though I don't know what that is, and you're going to help me, and I'm okay with that. And the next day, I tell them, hey, all that funding, it's gone. Oh yeah, and then you have to also watch out because they may be strategically coming after your organization. That is hard, and I think about that every day. We work with, across different states to figure out shields by which we can help alleviate some of those things. But just calling people every day, and I'm not only talking about environment, I'm not only talking about the things that I do. I have to call and be like, how are you? Right? How are you doing today? Just today. And you have to give people room to have that conversation as well, because they're not only dealing with environmental justice, they're dealing with immigration, they're dealing with groceries, they're dealing with it's a lot, and then it's a thorn. It's the one that gets you blood starts pushing out. But I would say, being in Maryland, there's hope we can do this.
Ditto. I feel very fortunate that the Just Needs legislation was submitted in 2023. We could not have foreseen what was ahead of us. The other interesting piece about this work is that the banned list of words, it does not flag on the banned list because it's just and not justice. It's not DEI. It kind of falls in this weird interstitial space, but that also means the thorn. There is no comparator in the United States for implementation of this kind of legislation, locally or at the state level or federal. So not only building while we fly it, but trusting the brilliance of colleagues, of communities who are very clear about where our investments have gone in the past. How we can think about those as cautionary tales or opportunities for shifting how we do this work. But it's also very significant. It is a big lift, and we can only also move at the speed of trust. Systems they're difficult to understand, right? How the cause of something creates a consequence. So that's also a challenge. Being able to say that it's not correlation, that we have direct input. That's where the MD Enviro screen helps a lot. But the other most significant challenge is people calling with the issues that Anika raised, and we are looking at historic inequity. So trying to balance the past with the present, and thinking about how do we do this work meaningfully each and every year, so that my hope is, if the data still exists that we use, which was federal, so if it's disappearing in real time, that we are actually able to evaluate using state level data the kinds of outcomes that we hope to see, and hoping in 5 years that the geographies we've identified won't still be just communities, or that we're thinking a little bit differently about the kinds of solution sets that can change those wealth and well-being outcomes.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to go to audience questions now. I have a couple here. But I first want to ask the audience a question, which is, okay, who learned something from this panel? Who learned something new? Excellent.
Thanks. Did you learn something that you are going to take back to your office to implement in your work? Yes, I did. Awesome. Yes, Allison, great. Okay. Are you eager to engage with state agencies on climate and equity solutions? Yeah, okay, but there's people from state agencies here, so are there people who don't work at state agencies who are now more encouraged to engage with state agencies on climate and equity work? Because I think the thing that, are folks online excited to engage with state agencies on climate and equity work? Because I think, I'll say it, they need to hear from and public participation and community engagement is a critical part of this work. And we need to make sure that, it's gonna sound harsh, but I don't mean that. We need to hold state agencies accountable for the work that the state needs to be doing. And this is that partnership. And if they're not hearing from us about the way to direct investments with limited resources and how creative ideas for navigating a difficult federal environment, we can partner and we can, and they need to hear from us. And that's part of today is making sure they're making sure that they're hearing from us. I'm gonna ask one question and then the majority of questions people submitted were about the sharing. I guess should surprise nobody on this stage or folks in the audience, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I did first want to ask about how DHCD have you considered an electric vehicle rideshare program that locates EVs near affordable housing developments and provides reduced rates for low income. So sort of blending that MDOT, Maryland Department of Transportation, DHCD low-income housing and electric vehicles program.
That's a great question, and it is also not my lane. So, our transportation our Division of Policy Strategy Research does more of that kind of policy work with MDOT. We currently have a MOU with them or other agencies that are administering direct program loans. So I would definitely take that recommendation back. I'm not sure. Nicola Tran is with DHCD and she'll be on a future panel today. So maybe some of these questions around energy would be best suited for her as well, because that is the work that she leads very well.
Great, and it's questions like that could, end up in partnership and end up with creative ideas with agencies. So, and now Anita and I will talk about chair. So, for those who don't know, the Cherish Our Communities Act was a piece of legislation that was introduced this year. It was the second iteration of that environmental justice and cumulative impacts bill. The second iteration of that bill, but really a piece of legislation that's more than a decade in the making. The first cumulative impacts bill was introduced in Maryland in 2014. And the idea behind cumulative impacts are, okay, everybody take a deep breath with me. Okay, so we took a breath. There was way more than one thing in that breath, right? And so don't think too much about it. But the idea behind cumulative impacts is that we are exposed to more than one thing at a time. We're exposed to pollution from more than one source at a time. And agencies' decision making should reflect just that need to look at what's going on in a community, in the surrounding environment before or as part of making another permitting decision. And that's because we see a concentration of polluting facilities in certain parts of the state. I want to give, maybe she won't do, but I want to give Kim Shiloh a shout out. She's here from Senator Brooks' office. He was the lead sponsor in the Senate of the Cherish Our Communities Act. That bill did not pass this year. And so it's more than a decade of not making progress on cumulative impacts in the state of Maryland. There is a requirement that the EJ score is included on some of these permits. We talk about a ton of data and information that the agency has, but right now the agency does not have the legal authority to make a permitting decision based on environmental justice. you could, potentially have conversations with the permit applicant about putting some additional conditions to alleviate some burden, but the state cannot deny a permit based solely on environmental justice data or information. And that is what the Cherish Act seeks to resolve. And it's really about that return on investment, what building and well-being. But the fiscal notes don't always say that on bills. So anyway, so that's sort of a very, very high level what the industry really came out in force in opposition to this bill, and probably because it was making some progress, and that we could not really go forward before what's known as Crossover Day in Annapolis. The Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition is the coalition that was the lead advocacy for the bill. It's made up of a number of different community-based and frontline organizations, partner organizations like Maryland LCD. And so that's a very high-level summary. And I think that was the gist of the questions was sort of what happened, why isn't it moving forward, how can an EJ score actually affect MDE permit approvals or denials? And then, how does the community engagement go past just meetings? How are we making sure that the community leadership is reflected in the agency decision? So that's a high level overview of what happened, what was the core of the bill, one of the main reasons to move forward. And then,
yeah, you covered that very well, Rebecca, about the hours spent trying to get another one, but we'll have a crack at it in short order. But right now, as Rebecca pointed out, the law requires that the EJ score and the report be included with certain permits for MDE that come before MDE. So not even all of them, just certain ones. The law says it just says that it has to be included. It doesn't give us the authority to do anything with that information. We push that a lot, right? And we engage with the applicant if the number is EJ score is above 75 or 5 or more of the indicators have a score that are above 75. We engage with the applicant and discuss ways in which they can possibly mitigate their impact in a certain community. For all intents and purposes, it's a voluntary conversation. It is not mandated. We have some companies that will jump on board and have that conversation, be willing to indulge in mitigation efforts to offset their impacts. There are others that basically can tell us what I'm saying, because we don't have that express authority. In very limited scopes, we can challenge the system, but we have to be very strategic around how we do that. Recently, we were able to deny a permit. It's a lot of legalese and I won't get into it, but it's the closest thing that we were able to do was denying a permit related to EJ. But it was in a very, very narrow scope that the courts gave it to us in our favor. So it wasn't as broad as we would have hoped. It kicked the door a little too wide, but it did give us a hope that we could be successful if we are challenged. The issue with not having that express authority is that we will get challenged, right, in court. And it goes to judge on if we will be successful or not. And we would have to do that kind of repetitively for each permit instead of having that blanket approval to allow for us to go through that process. But we're not deterred. I have conversations with companies all the time. When those numbers pop up and they're on my radar, they see my smile on my face. We talk through how we can get to a resolution. And then what we do is that outreach guidance that we talk about, we also do that engagement with the community. And we say, hey, what do you want to see? What are things that you want to see happen? We take in that information, we take in information from others that want to engage in that process. We then go back to our strategic planning around the permit and then issue the decision with changes. The permits that I've worked on since I've gotten here, I mean, if you think about one permit, they had a permit for 100 years, their conditions never changed. Last year was the first time we issued that permit for conditions based on input from the community and some areas that we felt we would be victorious in if we went to court. We are in court, still in court.
there
So
was a permit issued in 1926. that there hasn't been an issue? Like, just take this, there's a lot of things that have changed since that. Okay. Thank you.
Right. So that process, it's one by one, it's very resource intensive. It has to get done right now, but a bill of caliber of character will help mitigate some of that, and then take a lot of the challenges off the table that we can get from the others who were permitting, those facilities. But right now, we're doing it in the latter, with the hopes that one day we'll have a bill.
Thank you. And you might wonder, why we go in depth on environmental justice and cumulative impacts bill at a climate summit, climate forum? And it's because that the intersection of environmental justice and climate justice is very clear. Where there is high levels of pollution, people living nearby have less ability to respond to additional threats from climate change. It is much more difficult on a extremely hot day to breathe when there is a lot of air pollution concentrated nearby. It is very difficult to regulate your body temperature when there is additional air pollution nearby. See, I'm an air person. Don't go into the water where the water intersection is. But this intersection of climate vulnerability and environmental justice is very clear and compounding. And so that's why we're going in depth on environmental justice and community investment at a climate summit. It's interesting, another bill that passed this year was about insurance and climate change and being able to provide insurance in areas that are more vulnerable to flooding, and how it's completely changing the insurance. And where does that hit first? Low-income communities, low-income households. And so these are absolutely intersecting issues that, again, I'm a public health person, so I look at the root cause. And if we look at that root cause and we address upstream challenges, we're going to see multiple beneficial effects. So join me, please, in thanking our panel. Next up on the agenda, we have a break. So I think we're going to take a brief break and then reconvene for the next panel. So thank you very much.
I think I have the privilege of asking you all to take your seats so we can get started, I think. Laura or somebody else I forgot to ask, is somebody going to take any updates and checks as we go, or angry faces or anything like that? What should I like to? Great. I've been known to go over time. Okay, good morning, everybody. Hold on, please. Good morning, everybody. My name is Josh Fulkin. I'm the director of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, and we will be facilitating a panel discussion about climate investments and climate finance. I'm going to give a little bit of an intro and context setting, but first just wanted to introduce our guests. I'm thrilled to be joined by an amazing panel today. Megan Conklin is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the State of Maryland and Chief Climate Advisor to Governor Mueller. To her right is Jenna Yosa, the Chief of Staff for the Maryland Energy Administration. And on the end, we have Kim Pezza, the Chief Resilience Director for the Office of the Comptroller. Finance, money. Turns out it's pretty important. Broadly speaking, those of us who work on climate change and energy policy every day understand that climate change costs a lot to society, to individuals. Pollution harms our health and the communities from the point of extraction, transmission, and generation when we burn fossil fuels. Climate change overall will bring billions and trillions of damage across the world, significant harm to Maryland as one of the most vulnerable states to the impacts of climate change. Almost every policy whether it's building electrification or clean energy, or electric vehicles. When you incorporate the social costs and the health costs, every single one of these policies saves money. However, saving people money on their health care doesn't instantly create money in the state budget. Preventing harm through Chesapeake Bay does not instantly create money in the state budget. And so despite knowing these net positives, the challenge for the state of Maryland is to figure out how to find and generate and prioritize and allocate and spending money to advance our goals. And much of our strategy was integrated with a bold proposal from the federal government several years ago to be our partner, to fund a variety of programs via the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and so many others. And that context has changed significantly and creating a really interesting and challenging moment for Maryland, where Maryland still has its ambitious goals, but is wrestling with a more difficult financial situation. And our goal today is to dig in with these experts and find out what great work their agencies are doing, how they are wrestling with these changes, and what the future might bring. So we're going to start off with a little bit of a softball question. Just kidding, I don't have any softball questions. For Megan, federal climate commitments made between 21 and 2024 are now really under threat, and Maryland is not being invited to propose new federal funding proposals to the federal government. What is the status of all of the federal funding you were hoping for, and what might the future bring when it comes to federal funding? And where are you looking for other sources of funding or other funding strategies moving forward?
Well, thanks for that question. You know, our first several years of this administration, we focused really aggressively on applying for as many federal funding opportunities under the IRA and the IIJA as we possibly could. A little bit of background on me: before I came to Maryland, I spent most of my career working in the federal government. I had just come out of the office of Maryland's senior senator, Chris Van Hollen, and helped write a couple of the provisions on the IRA. And so really proud of the fact that we were able to receive commitments on about $13 billion in funding under the IRA and the IIJA. As you know, since the Trump 2 administration has taken office, we've seen a real attack on those funds, and a number of those funds being rescinded, a lot of them in litigation. For example, the Solar for All program, Maryland was set to receive $62 million through our partner, Maryland Community Center. Those monies were rescinded after they had already been obligated, which is a pretty unique situation that's currently being challenged by MCEC and a number of other states. What I can't share, I am proud to share that thanks to the hustling of your agencies here in Maryland, we do have some programs that have not been rescinded by the Trump administration, including $147 million that the Maryland Port Authority received to do, climate and efficiency upgrades at the port, which we're really proud of. And got my colleague Allison T there in the back, who is our shepherd of our climate pollution reduction grants, and she's doing a fantastic job. Maryland received over $130 million in funding. Some of that is through the Atlantic States Coalition. They're doing a lot of agroforestry and sort of rehabilitation type work. And they just closed a request for proposals related to that pot of funding. And then we're also part of the Clean Corridors Coalition, which will provide funding to do heavy-duty truck EV charging along the I-95 corridor. And they've got a request for proposals that's going out this year. So we do have some work on federal funding that continues. We'll see where this goes and whether or not this commitment was honest or not. But we also, through MEA, should be receiving, I think, about $162 million in funding from home energy rebates. This is something that I actually wrote an underlying bill for when I worked for Chris Van Hollen, the Homes and Hero rebates, which will go to states to do electrification and other home energy efficiency rebates to Marylanders. Secretary Wright, the Federal Secretary of Energy, made some comments at the Building Performance Association annual meeting 2 weeks ago, where he made it sound like they may start to obligate those funds. Or obviously, then, there's very anxious to see that actually happens. But that's potentially some good news on the federal funding side that I wanted to share.
Thank you, Megan. I'm going to take us on a journey down with first questions to all the panelists on the current programs, and then we're going to expand out to a little bit of what the future brings. Jen, the Maryland Energy Administration has received a significant boost in the funding it's receiving largely from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, including, I think, $200 million over a couple of years for a clean energy grants program. I think one of the largest allocations we've ever seen from the seed to MEA. Would love to hear what is the focus or the priorities of the current programming, and has this changed the way that MEA needs to be operating or is operating with this increased funding and perhaps increased spotlight?
Yeah, thank you for that, that question. So, I hate using acronyms, and I know the CEIF is one that is maybe confusing to some folks. So I do want to say the Strategic Energy Investment Fund is a completely special funded pot of money. It comes from two primary sources. One, and the one that has been growing lately, are the alternative compliance payments that are associated with our renewable portfolio standard. So when utilities are not necessarily making the investments in clean energy to meet our renewable portfolio standard, they make alternative compliance payments which go into the CEIF. The second source of funding is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative quarterly auction. So that is, I think, 11 or 12 Mid-Atlantic and Northeastern states. It's a carbon market for our utilities or our generation. So when our funding goes up, which it has in the last couple of years, it means that we are either seeing additional generation through the carbon market purchase, or we are seeing additional payments into these alternative compliance payments. So that has really been what's been happening for the past couple of years. And so I want to sort of level set there, because while the increased money into the CEIF has been great, and MEA has been deploying it, what it also fundamentally suggests is that something is not quite right with our renewable portfolio standard. And those direct investments into clean energy are not being made. So I want to sort of lay that out there. Now I want to tell you a little bit about how MEA has been utilized in the past 2 years, these increased alternative compliance payments. First and foremost, we have a portfolio of programs. So almost all of that money goes right back out the door to Marylanders. We run a variety of programs that are focused on improving the energy efficiency of our buildings. That might be local governments, that might be school districts, that is low to moderate income residential buildings. We even have commercial and industrial programs. So we're really trying to reach a broad cross-section of Marylanders to both improve their energy efficiency, which is hopefully going to reduce some of their demand, and then to deploy clean energy. And most of that has really gone into solar. We have a fairly robust community solar program that is really focused on sort of buying down access to clean energy for those experiencing low to moderate income in Maryland. So we work with community solar providers to make sure that they are subscribing low to moderate income Marylanders
And those Marylanders are seeing at least a 25% reduction in their energy bill. The General Assembly session that just ended just a couple of weeks ago also put some additional funding into NEA's budget for fiscal year 27. The lion's share of that is going to be for grid scale solar, so this is larger than community solar. It's going to be a competitive auction, so we're going to try to maximize the megawatts on our grid through this infusion of additional $100 million or so. And then I would say thanks to, I think, the advocacy of a lot of folks within this group, we're receiving an additional $72 million for direct deployment of heat pumps across Maryland. So we'll be standing up a brand new program before September. Our proposed launch is going to be in September of this year to deploy that heat pump.
Thank you. I'm going to do a follow-up question. Thank you for explaining the acronyms. I even had a note for myself to do that. I want to just play this out a little bit. So we have the two sources of the money into the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. RGGI, or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. The payments there are from an auction based on goals. We're trying to reduce pollution, or that might have a more aggressive auction. So more money from RGGI does not signify something is going wrong. More money from alternative compliance payments signifies that utilities are purchasing these credits instead of being able to purchase enough clean energy. And I guess the very blunt question is, if the program is hypothetically successful and the alternative compliance payments go to zero, then that would mean a loss of funding for certain MEA partners. Can you talk to us about maybe which of those programs are? Because I think it's important for people to understand that there are some programs that are just like, now we're trying to make up for we didn't get enough yes. And there are other programs that hit on other values such as equity or certain demographics.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Josh, and I appreciate you asking it. So the alternative compliance payments that we get are very restricted. We can use them essentially for tier 1 renewable energy deployment. So that means solar, that means geothermal, and I believe that means land-based wind are functionally what we can deploy. What MEA has found, I think, the greatest success with is solar. And so we have programs for residential rooftops that came out of the Brighter Tomorrow Act a couple of years ago. We have our very successful community solar program. And then we have used that funding to put solar on schools, on community-facing buildings like rec centers or other public health buildings. We have been putting solar on commercial buildings. And so if the alternative compliance payments go away, that would be the hope, or that would be an indication that the renewable portfolio standard is more directly accomplishing the goals of getting renewable energy on our grid. And those types of programs at MEA would likely be reduced to what they used to be, which was a much smaller portion of our budget.
Thank you. We're going to shift now a little bit to thinking about the other side of the finances, the impact on the state. Kim, the Comptroller's Office brings sort of a distinct perspective on the fiscal case for climate change. There's a few initiatives your office has been working on this year on trying to understand the cost of climate change on the state of Maryland, or how much money Maryland is spending on different aspects of mitigation, adaptation. you tell us about the work of your office and how you're related to assessing the financial impact on the climate change in Maryland?
Sure, thanks Josh, thanks everybody for being here. Yes, I'm in kind of a unique position. The Office of the Comptroller actually never had a climate person before. And so that's because the foresight of comptroller was that hunting does cost a lot of money. They will impact our economy, and we need to take that into consideration right now. So we've been assigned to the state legislature gave us the responsibility to conduct a study on the cost of climate change. Formerly the bill was called the Renew Act, and what we'll be doing is we'll be studying the calculation of costs that have been incurred, the costs that will be incurred by the state due to increasing greenhouse gas emissions and that extreme weather that comes from that. It will also include the costs necessary to adapt to climate change. And finally, it will include an economic analysis of whether any costs would be passed through to taxpayers should Maryland fossil fuel industry be liable to provide financial damages to our state for that climate pollution. So right now we have just begun working with a vendor called Center for Climate Strategies, and they have years of experience in these kind of reports. And we've also stood up an interagency work group. So the comptroller wanted to make sure all the agencies are at the table so that we can help inform this study to make sure it meets the needs of the state and it meets the needs of the law. And about a year ago, I actually wrote a real short, brief report on the costs associated with climate change, kind of outlining all the different aspects that are going to be impacted by climate change. And so this is now, the state legislature has said, really, this more massive comprehensive report. And that hopefully will get some results by the end of the year. And yeah, looking forward to working on that.
Thank you. So we're going to shift gears a little bit to what financing is going to look like moving forward. The estimates from the most recent FY 2027 budget are that the expenditures from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund to MEA, to DHCD, and roughly 400 million in diversions to the general fund will bring the balance of the seed down somewhere between 0 to 100 million. So the large amount that had been built up in the fund that has been spent the last 2 years will have been depleted. So I think it is fair to say that moving forward, any money deployed will be based on any money that's coming in each one of these years. And perhaps if we're more successful on addressing our climate goals, we'll see a decrease, potentially a decrease in some of those funds, which really brings us back to the question. We have ambitious climate goals and ambitious electrification program through the building energy performance standards and the proposed zero emission heating equipment standards and ambitious electric vehicle program. We don't just have an aggressive goal, we have aggressive policy objectives. So the first question is, what are some of the strategies that the state is or should be looking at to identify new sources of funding, either broadly for addressing climate change or for helping to implement specific climate change related policy goals? And this one I'm giving to anybody in the group.
Yeah, I just wanted to start off with some general comments about climate and clean energy action funding in the Maryland's budget. So this past fiscal year 27 budget, which Governor Moore just signed 2 weeks ago, we were really proud to include $306 million in clean energy and climate action funding, much of that coming out of the seat, which Jen did such a great job explaining what that is. But really important funding in there. One of the things that we focused on as one of the large investments in there is roughly about $100 million in funding that will go out of MEA to solar and other local clean energy projects. And that was meant to back up the loss of equivalent federal programs, like the loss of the solar ITC tax credit. So that was one sort of large goal that we focused on. Also really proud of the work of Josh Tolkien and many others in this room to get the $73 million in funding for each promise. I think that that's really spectacular. So congratulations to many of you. I know you all pushed really hard for that. The state legislature and the governor have also been very focused, as we heard in David Lapp's wonderful opening comments on energy costs. It's something that we hear consistently from Marylanders as an everyday concern. So there was an additional $100 million, as was done also in fiscal year 26, that's devoted to money going back to Marylanders to offset the costs of their utility bills. So that's a little bit about this year. In the fiscal year 26 budget, we included an additional $100 million in funding. A lot of that was focused on solar on state property. With the MDOT facilities, MDOT's actually hired a full-time implementer who's working on deploying more solar on MDOT properties and also to local grants for local clean energy projects. In fiscal year 26, we also included the additional $100 million going back to Marylanders to offset the cost of their utility bills. So we're really proud of that funding the last couple of years. I think as we look into the future, we see the need for climate funding as being sort of a shared responsibility. I don't see it just as federal funding or as state funding. Really interested in engaging with our green fund banks. I know the General Assembly, thanks to the leadership of Mr. Gallagher, included an additional $15 million, I believe, for Maryland's green bank, Mountain Clean Energy Center. So leveraging more money for green banks and private philanthropies. I know we have Jennifer Leslie here today, who represents Northern Maryland's philanthropies. So we're continuing to be interested in those options as well.
Yeah, I think being maybe creative with the funding that we do have is a really important consideration. And I wanted to highlight one of the programs that NEA is standing up that hopefully will be leveraging some additional private dollars. So Josh mentioned our building energy performance standards, and that is what was a part of the Climate Solutions Now Act that requires the owners of buildings 35,000 square feet or greater to basically reduce their energy consumption and reduce the emissions associated with operating their buildings. And so one of the things that NEA, in partnership with MDE, has been doing is really trying to provide technical assistance to these building owners to encourage what we're calling first movers, the early adopters. They had to start benchmarking, I think, this past fall. But it's really several years out before they have to start meeting these reduced emissions or these energy use reductions. So we're trying to find the willing early participants and providing technical assistance to these folks and then sharing their stories. We've created what we're calling a first movers sort of monthly webinar where owners of buildings, and in many cases they are multi-building campuses, are sharing how they're going about planning and deploying their own funding to make these kinds of capital improvements to their buildings so that they will be in compliance down the road. This year, I guess in fiscal 27, we will be providing some additional funding for direct technical assistance for these building owners that are trying to do the right thing. And so I think that's just one example of using a little bit of funding to try to get folks who are going to be regulated into compliance as early as we can, And then to help them think about their own financing needs, their own capital needs to be compliant with the law.
Join Megan in thanking folks in this room for instance, passing the Renew Act, and I'd like to do that before. In addition to what's already happening budget-wise, what our office is doing out to the comptroller is we have this fiscal management system, and over the years we've figured out that it doesn't quite do all the things we want, like we can't quite figure out what we are already spending on climate change and environmental sustainability. So as we develop a new system, which will be implemented in the next 3 to 5 years, I've joined along with the Department of Budget Management and the Department of Environment here to help guide them to ensure that going forward we can tag or code our climate spending. And I think that will help to inform our future budgets really well.
Thank you. First, when do I go to the questions, or do I keep going for a little while and then? Yeah, I'll take a look at them. One of the creative strategies that the Inflation Reduction Act employed several years ago was creating technical support funding for communities in order to apply for the federal grant. Really confusing. And oftentimes, if there wasn't technical support, communities that would have directly benefited weren't ready to apply. And so they put out these technical support grants for communities to go through the discussions, the process, the identification of partners in order to be able to turn in an application. And that gives us a little bit of a window into how we might strategically use funding when funding is limited in order to set ourselves up, perhaps in the hopes of a brighter time or a shift in federal funding opportunities. Our climate plan, I hate using this term abstractly, but an estimated cost of implementation would cost around $900 million a year across building electrification, vehicle electrification, clean energy in order to hit these ambitious goals. That is not the level of funding we currently have. I'd like to ask each of you if you have any thoughts on how the state can best approach prioritization. Strategic use of the funds, do we make adjustments to the timing or the pacing or the policy in a way that it means that instead of just sort of having a scarcity mentality, you're developing a strategy within this restricted funding universe? Or is there a way that conversation, if there's not an answer, is there a way that conversation could take place so that there's more of a sort of shared recognition of where we're currently at and how to make the best of it?
So I will say that this is something that the Maryland Energy Administration is thinking about a lot. Most of you probably know that we recently got a new director who came on board in January. And one of the things that she has asked us to do is to sort of reorient our funding programs alongside our emission sectors. So we're looking at the work that MDE is doing in terms of quantifying where we have the greatest emissions to better inform how we want to be deploying our funding within the funding restrictions that the legislature sort of imposes. So that's one new thing for FY27 that we're going to be looking at. The second thing that we are really trying to do is to think about who we're serving. And I'm really proud to say that we are trying to focus more of our funding on those who have the highest energy burdens, those who may be more impacted by their BGE rate going up, or the cost of fuel oil going up, or the cost of gasoline going up. Because there are many families in Maryland that can't weather the kinds of dramatic increases that we've seen in our utility bills, in the cost of fuel, and in the cost of other households or daily items. So we're really looking at sort of beefing up those programs that specifically serve our low to moderate income families and residents, and trying to put as much money as we can into those pools to serve those who are being most impacted.
That was a great answer from Jen. I just wanted to back it up with there's sort of three buckets that as I'm sitting here that we've really prioritized on in the last couple of years. First, we're fortunate in Maryland that clean energy is the fastest and cheapest option for dealing with our surging energy demands, and it's aspirational in our state, it's deployable. We focus a lot on solar in Maryland, and as I've talked through some of our funding priorities of what has been funded in the last two budgets, the $50 million that went to solar on state property and fiscal year 26, and this year the $100 million that will go to solar and other types of local clean energy projects. So that's been a focus in our funding has been on solar. Wind was something government was very focused on when he first came into office in 2023. We're going to be the wind governor. As you know, we had the U.S. wind project, a number of other big offshore wind projects in progress. Unfortunately, just with the changes in the federal administration, it's not been as big of a focus right now, but I'm sure we will come back to that because I still believe that that is a big part of Maryland's future. So hopefully once we have a more hopeful administration in 2028, we can go back to focusing more on wind. Second, as I mentioned, we did focus in this year's budget on trying to back up the loss of federal investments to help our state-based clean energy companies that were feeling the losses from the loss of some of the tax credits, like the solar ITC tax credit. So that was one of the ideas behind the $100 million that was provided for solar and other local clean energy projects, was to back up the loss of federal funding. And third, as Jen mentioned so eloquently, one of our grant programs that has been most overprescribed at MEA, a ton of interest in, has been EV charging and charging infrastructure in low to moderate income communities. And so a real focus on getting charging infrastructure now has been really important.
I could talk about something else we're thinking about in the future. So the Department of Budget Management and TE and I all took part in a year-long program. It was an international climate finance funding program. Well, Rachel, we're up here on stage. I'll have her take the mic on this. But going forward, we'll be working together to think about our future finance planning strategies for resilience and so forth. So we're thinking ahead as well.
Thank you. Jen, I really appreciate you talking about sort of the way you're trying to create that focus. And one thing that we've noticed this last year is that there was a lot of scrutiny, rhetoric and scrutiny on these sources of funding, the alternative compliance payments, the regional greenhouse gas initiative, and Empower. What are your offices able to do, or what do you think is important to help lawmakers or the public understand the importance of this funding or the benefit of these programs, so that they can be perhaps better defended in these public dialogues? And I'm just going to give you a Jen on this one.
Sure, Josh. I think that it is a key question, and again, it's something that we have been looking, internally to try to answer. The short answer is we need to do a better job of lifting up the stories, of the communities, the individuals, the small businesses that have benefited from grants or other financial assistance that's come from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. We are starting to really think about that. For example, we have a host of grantees from some of our more overburdened communities that have really decided to take on this idea of resilience hubs. As a resident of Baltimore City, I'm really proud that Baltimore City has sort of spearheaded this idea of community resilience. And so we want to tell the stories of the churches or the schools or the food pantries that are not only serving community on a day-to-day basis, but are also installing solar on their rooftop and a battery backup so that when winter storm burn or a heat wave happens, community members have a place to go to charge their phones or to keep their medicine cold or to charge their medical devices. There are a lot of really amazing folks doing some work that we have not been doing our best to elevate and to share that. So my hope, is that over the next 6 to 9 months, the interim, we're going to develop some of those stories so we can better share how the SEEP is being deployed and how it's changing lives.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm going to add a little bit of moderator commentary here and say that there's also a role for advocates and academics to be telling a better story about these programs and how they work. That might involve asking for better information to tell a better story. But I will share as a personal note that our experience was that when we went in and talked to legislators about changes in SEEP, it was sort of an abstract notion of an abstract word that they didn't understand. When we began to work with our friends at Action and Memory and Interfaith Power and Light and many others advocating for heat pump deployments, we were able to have concrete conversations with the legislators about what this would actually mean for everyday people and in their lives. And I think there's an important lesson there in how we take climate financing abstractly, turn it into a conversation about some critical public good. We got some questions I'm going to pass along now. The Relief Act was important in many ways, but the Relief Act also included cuts to energy efficiency and power and solar net metering. How are you all planning to support energy efficiency upgrades for Marylanders and net metering despite these cuts?
So I can address at least part of that. So one of the things that we are looking at doing for our FY27 budget is more than doubling the funding for what we call our residential energy equity program. That is our program that funds nonprofit organizations and local governments to work directly with low to moderate income Marylanders to do energy efficiency improvements in their homes and other sort of health and safety upgrades that are needed to accommodate, say, getting a heat pump or getting solar panels. This has been a really popular program. We've found really good results. And so we're looking at, like I said, more than doubling the amount of money in that program for fiscal year 27. Will it make up for the entirety of what was reducement in power? No, but we are trying to focus our resources more into some of our low moderate income programs.
We know that a significant portion of funding from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund was utilized for balancing the general budget. Remember the general fund this last year and the year before. Again, can we anticipate that might happen again? And what can community members who would like to see 100% of that going to climate-related funding due to, or who should they talk to? How should they approach that issue?
Well, thanks for this question. I know you want to say your advocacy does make a difference for all of you in the room. I mean, for the work that you did this past year, that 73 million, Josh, and so many people in the room for the Discount Rebate Program is really based on advocacy from so many people in this room. And the governor also made a decision, and we're so glad to be partnering now with Comptroller Learman on fully funding the UAC study. In December, we announced adding an additional $407 million to fund the UAC study over 2 fiscal years, and we've been working in cooperation with the Comptroller's Office. All around the state agencies are sitting on panels and helping provide all the data that's needed for this important study to be completed through the end of the year. And I appreciate all of your advocacy of this, so those of you care so much about seeing that study funded. As for the diversions, as Joshua mentioned, that is in light of Maryland's very unique budget situation that we've been through for the past 2 fiscal years. Heading into this fiscal year, for example, what happened in the One Big Beautiful Bill, or One Ugly Bill, I hope Steve termed the name, One Big Ugly Bill, I think I prefer that one. It caused significant impacts on the state's budget through the changes that were made to the SNAP programs and to Medicaid programs. And so we were heading into session in another very unique situation. So there have been diversions out of the seat into the general fund. I can't say whether or not I think they're going to happen again in the future. All I can say is I don't know, but all of you should definitely work closely with DBM Secretary Jake Wiseman. As we head into next year, make your views known. I just can't really tell you whether I think it will continue to happen. We just have to continue to see the issue.
Great. So I just want to offer some closing remarks here. If I had enough in advance, I would offer you some time for that. I first just want to share that I'm honored to be on this panel with these 3 climate leaders. There's a lot of challenging dynamics across our climate policy and lots of changes. And we have staff people working day in and day out to run these programs, make the absolute best of these policies, jump when the legislature says, here's the money, figure out how to spend it. And Kim and Jen and Megan are in the trenches every day working on that. So just a huge appreciation for them, a huge appreciation for the deployment of the clean energy funding and the building electrification funding. We've gotten some really good ideas here about ways for us to lift up and defend the funding in the future. And it is my hope that we can stay connected with you over the next year, learning about progress on any of these fronts and strategizing together about how to get more money for the really great work that you all and so many others are doing.
Great, thanks everyone. We're gonna get started with our 3rd and final panel here, and then we'll have a chance for some discussion afterwards. So appreciate everyone being here. A quick note on accessibility. If anybody needs captioning to be able to hear and follow well, please let Laura know. We do have this meeting streamed on the Zoom platform, which does have the captioning available. So if for whatever reason you want to follow that, we can help you get the Zoom link so you can follow on your phone and see the captions as well. So Laura, who may be gathering people from the back right now, will be just up over there. All right, well, our 3rd panel here is on buildings and electrification, which I'm excited for. We've got 3 great panelists who are going to be able to speak to both the policy work happening at the state, as well as getting into the weeds a bit on the implementation, which I'm excited for after a lot of our other conversations. I'm moderating. I'm Justin Berry. I'm with Green and Healthy Homes Initiative and our representative for Climate Partners, so excited to be facilitating this. Buildings and electrification are one of our Climate Partners policies for this coming year. Folks may already be aware, direct fossil fuel use in buildings is about 16% of our state climate emissions, so one of the top emissions contributors, and electricity use is also going to contribute to the emissions as well. So it brings in both fuel switching and efficiency and the decarbonization of the electric generation sector. It's also an area where we know how to do the interventions we need. We know how to make buildings more efficient. We know how to make buildings electrified. It's not a technical issue at this point. We've got funding and financing challenges. There's some amount of the market coming around to appreciating the benefits of electric buildings. But we know the path forward, and it's about taking those steps to get there quicker and more successfully. We also have successful programs in Maryland, which we'll be able to speak to, where we can see progress happening on the ground. And I'm excited to talk about the lessons learned from this. At the same time, we still have some challenges remaining. Affordability, we'll talk about. But also from the policy side, we haven't quite gotten to the point of passing the specific policies that Climate Partners thinks of as key market signals, that signal that the future of buildings in Maryland are going to be all electric, right? We haven't quite gotten to the point of having all electric new construction. We've got rulemaking processes on appliance standards to be zero emissions, but haven't quite gotten there. So as we're talking about the successes and the lessons learned from the initial implementation, also want to keep in mind the question of how we keep building momentum to kind of break through and have these more broad policies passed that send the signals that this is the direction we're fully going to. So with that introduction, I'm going to start turning it over to my great panelists. I'm going to ask each of you a question that will allow you to introduce yourself and your work. So I'm going to start with Rachel with MDE. One of the big policies that we do have on the books that is being implemented is the Building Energy Performance Standards, BEPS. We've heard a little bit about this already. It's requiring large buildings to benchmark their energy and eventually reduce their emissions and their energy intensity. So Rachel, if you don't mind introducing yourself and your work, as well as talking about how it's going with BEPS, what we're learning, what the challenges are, and the successes so far.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Lamb. I'm Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy and International Affairs here at the department. And I want to start by highlighting something that you said. Buildings are an incredibly important part of our decarbonization strategy because they represent 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions across the state, and they take up 93% of the electricity. So that means they're a huge part of the opportunity that we have to not only have cleaner, healthier homes for people, but also really support long-term decarbonization in the places that people work, play, and live. So you highlighted one of our keystone building policies, BEPS, Building Energy Performance Standards. MDE was required to stand up those standards as part of the groundbreaking Climate Solutions Now Act, and our team got to work. We've been working hard with listening sessions and stakeholder engagement, including engagement with many of you, to stand up a really important program that now covers more than 9,000 buildings across the state. And we're really proud that already we have seen so many of those buildings already beginning to benchmark or report their data to us, so that we can continue to work with them to decarbonize that trajectory over the long term into the 30s, the 2030s and the 2040s. Already just here in year one, 65% of those buildings, again, have either benchmarked with us or have otherwise told us that they're exempted. And we're so encouraged to see that more than 30% of those buildings already achieve the standards set out in BEPS. That means as they're building new construction or new buildings, they already are building to all electric standards, or they already are engaging in retrofits like heat pumps and other kind of weatherization work that are common sense, not just for achieving those greenhouse gas goals, but also because they pencil out and they make an economic impact. BEPS has also been the subject of a lot of discussion, both in the legislative sessions over the last couple of years. And so we've seen a lot of interest in looking for additional flexibilities in those programs. One of the key changes that was made was exempting hospitals, for example, which that property type or those building types are have an incredibly large greenhouse gas footprint relative to other buildings in the state. So maybe BEPS is not the current tool that we have to engage them, but that doesn't mean that building decarbonization isn't important across the grid. So we have to continue to think about ways that we can help, not just on the policy certainty, but bringing really innovative financial flexibilities to the table. Because we know that while a lot of these updates do pencil out over the medium to long term, a lot of times there's large capital upfront costs. So of course, we have to work with many other state agencies, including both DGS and DHD, as well as MEA, to figure out how we can leverage the tools that the state has to support those upgrades, but also think outside the box. And we've been doing quite a bit of that to figure out how to bring other nimble financial instruments to the table to help more of those building owners comply. So I could say more about that as we think about new tools we need in the toolbox, but I'm just so proud of our team for the work they've been doing to implement BEPS. And we'll just give them a shout out because the U.S. Green Building Councils awarded our building decarbonization team the Local Leadership Award for Organizational Excellence. And I want you to know that they're working on your behalf to do that. So thanks to the team.
Thanks, Rachel. Congratulations. That's great. For David's here with Department of General Services, and very excited to have them here because they have the responsibility of the state-owned buildings, and understand that DGS adopted an all-electric policy for state-owned facilities in 2025, which applies to a significant amount of square footage of buildings, and been working on developing the plan for that. Can you speak to what working through that portfolio has taught you about how to make electrification work in practice, and what support helps make those plans come to fruition or be able to be developed?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. David St. Jean. I'm with the Director of the Office of Energy and Sustainability at Department of General Services. So the easy answer and quick answer is just send money. But other than that, this is not an engineering problem. This is really a financial problem. It's a political problem. But we have the solutions there, and as implementers, DGS, that's kind of what we look at. We are given a task, decarbonize our buildings, electrify our buildings, and we go out and look and try to figure out how to do that. So when Climate Solutions Now Act passed, we immediately created a solicitation, hired we pre-qualified 3 consultants who develop decarbonization planning for large organizations. So we hired one to look at 17.5 million square feet of state facilities. It's a mix of standalone buildings in large campuses, including some large correctional facilities, one of which burns 1.2 million gallons of fuel oil a year. So these are complex operations. They're burning a lot of fossil fuels and converting them all to electricity on a fairly short timeline. So although we haven't actually started down the path of that plan, the plan does have several budget milestones that we're looking at, and we're sharing now with the administration and with DBM to start trying to plan the budgets for decarbonizing our facilities between now and 2040. And it's going to be a bit of a challenge, but I do think that if you look at the life cycle cost of all of the decarbonization for this group of buildings, it's not paying for itself, but the costs are not phenomenal. They're not outside of what the state certainly can afford to do if it rearranged a few of its priorities. So we're kind of hopeful that this can be done, and done on the time frame that by legislation we're supposed to. I will say that we've been trying to incorporate decarbonization not just through this decarbonization plan, but also for all new state buildings and major renovations, they have to follow what's called the High Performance Green Building Program. We amended that over the past year to align with BEPS so that any new state facility or any state facility that's greater than 7,500 square feet, so not just above 35,000 square feet, which would be for BEPS, but it has to be all electric. So anytime we're doing a major renovation of a state building or building a new state facility, it has to be all electric. And that includes for us new construction for K through 12 schools, which are exempt from BEPS, but they are covered under the High Performance Green Building Program. The other thing that we've done is we created a decarbonization policy for Department of General Services. So we support, I don't know, 16 or 17 state agencies, some large ones that own a lot of buildings, we get a constant churn of requests for replacing fossil fuel equipment, whether it's a boiler or even a water heater. And now we have a policy that says anytime that you do that, you have to replace it with an electric system. And you have to do it sort of holistically. So you're not just looking at replacing a gas boiler with an electric resistance boiler. You have to look at potentially installing a heat pump and changing the distribution system to make everything work. And there is some additional cost to that, but we've been in conversations with DBM to allow us to do that as we move forward with this. So that includes the state hospitals that may be exempt from BEPS, but they're not exempt from the DGS decarbonization policy. So we're looking at existing buildings and new buildings and moving forward over the next 15 years or so to try to get them into a position where they're not burning any fossil fuels on site.
Deserve an applause for that. Yeah, it's impressive to hear the scope of that, and I think not often something that gets a lot of attention. Nicola, for our last panelist here, Nicola Tran with DHCD. One of the key DHCD programs is the Low Income Empower Maryland program, which does energy efficiency programs for low-income households, including multifamily, and has started to offer electrification programs, right? So, you're interacting with folks who are not state buildings. Would love if you could speak to where you're seeing success with folks being interested in taking up electrification and where your challenges that remain, and your introduction as well.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nicola Tran, Director of the Whole Home Energy and Repair Programs at DHCD. I'm glad that you're all still here and didn't just stick around for lunch. So that's great to see. I'm happy to really talk about implementation today. DHCD administers a number of energy programs for low-income households and affordable housing properties, and that includes both restricted affordable housing properties as well as naturally occurring affordable housing properties, which are just multifamily buildings where low-income households happen to live. Through our programs, we have offered electrification for 3 years now. We received funding through the Climate Solutions Now Act for our greenhouse gas reduction program. And last year, the Empower Limited Income Energy Program also started to allow electrification with its new focus on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Since this change in the Empower program, adoption has been particularly strong in the multifamily energy efficiency programs that we run. We have funded 47 projects, so that's 47 multifamily affordable housing properties just since last year to various levels of electrification. That's from specific equipment changes to full electrification of an entire property. And I will say that on the multifamily side, the success is really driven through a perfect storm of a lot of beneficial factors coming together. One factor of that is BEPS. I think maybe, it has come through to the property owners now that this is inevitable. Greenhouse gas emissions have to be in their future. And being required to do so will incentivize them to seek out programs that can help them with making those changes. Another factor is our rental lending rehabilitation programs. DHCD operates a number of programs that provide funding for deep retrofits and rehabilitation to affordable housing properties that they typically have to make. So by having those programs in place and those programs requiring buildings now to consider electrification, by incentivizing electrification, provides another, so to say, carrot for them to make that change. One other additional factor is that the affordable housing community is a really cohesive, relatively cohesive community. Their properties all facing the same challenge and seeking the same solutions to continue to provide affordable housing. So they are very well connected. They're very tuned in with policies and requirements across the state, and they happen to be pretty early adopters because of their alignment with policies and knowing what's coming and driving the market. And then lastly, I think one of the main drivers for success in the implementation here is that we didn't go ahead and create a separate program, a separate process on how to get access to those electrification incentives. We already have a pipeline of more than 100 affordable housing properties coming through DHCD for other reasons. So we integrated the electrification funding into the same funding stream that the projects already go through. There's no separate application, there's no separate scope. It all flows in one funding stack, and funding goes out to the properties. Construction can happen at the same time, which makes it specifically cost effective to implement electrification.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I want to engage the audience here for just a second, because I know that while we're thinking about electrification, affordability and utility rates come to mind pretty immediately for folks. So easy one to start. Can you get a show of hands of folks who felt like their utility bills were high this winter? All right. Almost everyone. A few folks did not, which good for them. And then could you get a show of hands for folks who know they were heated by gas for their heat this winter? Okay, a little over half maybe. And then folks who were heated by electric? Oh, pretty good mix. Fuel or delivered fuel, something else, anyone? A couple, okay. And then for those with electric, was it, raise your hand if it was some type of heat pump technology, whether it's geothermal, others? All right, yeah, great. We're a climate community of being on that. Kudos. So we know that, as David Lapp talked about, right, the utility rates going up for both gas and electric puts a lot of pressure on both the math on fuel switching as well as just generally on paying bills. I think that that's important that we recognize both. We also have the challenge of the upfront costs, which we started to talk about here, and that presents another barrier. So for our panelists, I want to speak kind of how those are showing up in your work, as well as what other barriers you don't want us to lose sight of that might be coming up that maybe in addition to just some of the affordability pieces. So David, I'll start with you this time. Can you talk about how DGS is approaching financing these state projects and how that cost benefit analysis is going, or what you rely on to help support the math?
Sure. That is the big unknown for us currently. But I think we're trying to be creative as we can be. We're certainly taking advantage of all the Empower rebates. Up until now, we've collected $2.5 million, I think, since I've been there in utility rebates. That looks like it might change with the relief bill. We'll see what happens there. But my office manages the state's energy performance contracting program. So, I mean, it is a good way to leverage. If you're doing an electrification project, there's no way you should be doing it without also looking at the building's energy use intensity. So it's EUI. So energy efficiency projects typically can pay for themselves, sometimes, 15-year payback or less potentially for these projects. So we're looking at combining energy performance contracting with electrification to at least help leverage some of those costs. So it's not all coming from general funds. I will tell you that we requested some funding from MEA last year, which is now in our budget this year, to subsidize solar for state buildings that are in low to moderate income neighborhoods, right? So environmental justice neighborhoods, essentially. So these buildings currently burn either fuel oil or natural gas. We're using the funds from MEA to subsidize the cost of the solar, to pay it down to a point that we can now do energy performance contracts in those buildings to electrify them sort of on the backs of the cheap solar. So we're using the solar as if back in the day when we were just transitioning to LED light bulbs, you could do an entire building basically using the leverage of on the leverage of the energy savings from the LED light bulbs, you can install all kinds of other equipment. So we can't do that anymore with lighting technology because basically everywhere we go already has LEDs. But if we can buy down the cost of solar to like a 5-year payback, we can then install equipment, electric equipment that might have a 20-year payback when you balance the whole project out, you blend it out so that it actually pencils out, you can get an energy savings guarantee. So we're looking at this as kind of a win-win. So we're going to subsidize, we're going to buy down solar on these particular properties in these neighborhoods. We're then going to electrify the buildings, which then cleans up the air in the neighborhoods, and it makes the electricity costs for the state more affordable. So we're just trying to be as creative as we can and hope that the next federal administration, there will potentially be an understanding of this issue, and we'll get more federal money coming into the state, which is of course what we were all hoping for up until a year or so ago.
Appreciate that. Yeah. For DHCD and Nicola, you mentioned the uptake of the multifamily electrification programs, which is really exciting. Know that DHCD is scaling up services on single family and across the board and has had notable increases in production, while still lagging behind the pretty ambitious goals that have been set. So I'm curious if you can speak again to the general bottlenecks you kind of see in the programs, and the question of like how utility prices fit into that, or what else we should be paying attention to.
Right. Utility prices play a big factor in terms of creating a bottleneck for electrification adoption. So when we are talking about customer awareness and trust, we know that there are some very antiquated impressions of what a heat pump is, how it provides very cool heat, how it does not make you feel as warm and cozy as a gas furnace, how they're inefficient in very cold temperatures. Those were preconceived notions that already existed. But now in the affordability crisis that we're in, and everybody thinking that their energy bills are already too high, we're also trying to tell customers you should add more electric load to your bill. And that is a pretty hard sell at the moment. So there is a very significant need currently to raise awareness and educate customers on not only the technology and how far it has advanced, but also translating all the numbers of benefits of electrification into cost savings for them. There is a savings, a dollar savings in avoided health cost by having cleaner technology in your home. There are dollar savings connected to less maintenance. There are dollar savings through an increased home value. And that's something that we're working on together with our colleagues at MEA through outreach campaigns, together with our referral and network partners to bring the word out there that this is a technology that may upfront, look a little bit different than what we're used to. It looks like it may add electric to your bill, but in the long-term run and overall cost-effective analysis, it does save you money. I think upfront costs are still a pretty big factor for a lot of folks. We are trying to alleviate that by stacking funding wherever possible. On the single family side, we have access to 3 different programs that provide energy efficiency and electrification upgrades to low-income households. So by leveraging all this funding together, we can typically build very comprehensive projects with no upfront costs to low-income households. Another bottleneck is electrical infrastructure, and we see that both on the single family and multifamily side. Panel upgrades can often be very costly. Related health and safety upgrades can be very costly, and if funding is not provided for those upgrades, electrification may not be able to move forward. And lastly, one more item I'll mention is contractor capacity and training. There is still a shortage of contractors that are comfortable with heat pump technology or trained enough to convince customers of their benefits. And that's part of the awareness campaign that we're working on. And I'll add one more thing. I think how we're able to successfully address some of the cost effectiveness challenges is based on a DOE study. Oftentimes, one equipment conversion, let's say we're doing only the heat pump or we're doing only the water heater, sometimes does, as a standalone measure, not turn out to be cost effective. But once you start leveraging in weatherization measures, once you start adding on solar to the roof, that's how you can get really deep savings, up to 25% of energy usage.
Thanks for that. I'll turn back to you, Rachel, for the next question. And no, MDE kind of has the role of taking the economy-wide or sector-wide look at this transition. Is there anything you would want to add for us as we're thinking about, as we go through this transition, what may change when we're thinking about prices and opportunities on building electrification?
Yeah, I want to build on something that you were talking about, Nicola, in terms of the sort of the residential kind of building sector is when we look at total energy burden, we can identify those areas where electrifying and moving away, especially from fuel oil or propane heat, makes good economic sense, right? It's those households, those families that stand to benefit the most by making the transition. When we look at total energy burden and we combine weatherization with electrification, we start to see a tremendous amount of positive impact, right? We start to see households that have immediate relief on their utility bills. We start to see lower demand on the grid, and we continue to see those use cases that highlight the benefits of electrification. And as we continue to improve that process and make that information more accessible to customers, that's where we'll see greater levels of adoption. So that brings me to the Zero Emission Heating Equipment Standards, or ZHES. So this is a program that we've been exploring with multiple other states throughout the Northeast who also are asking, what does it look like to make sure that consumers actually have information they need to make a cost analysis? So if you think about your contractor coming to your home and maybe you had a challenge with your heating equipment or your air conditioner goes out. I know from my personal experience, it can be hard, right? You ask 5 different contractors who give you different information and different pricing quotes, and sometimes it's really hard to make sense of that information and to figure out what you can do to get that system up and running again very soon, and also do it in a cost-effective way. So we've been exploring models for this standard that really try to reduce long-term energy burden and make those costs transparent to you, the customer. And by doing that, we think we can really help support those cases where, again, the immediate economic benefit is clear and it really helps that homeowner make that transition. And we have to tie that kind of information opportunity with continued focus on resources to continue to support, especially low to moderate income families that even with that information may still find challenge in making sort of the jump or to supporting that equipment purchase. So by making sure that we have more incentives in place to families who need them, by making that information more clear and explicit to customers, that's really going to support helping people find relief, because we know that affordability is one of the critical challenges, and we believe electrification can actually support that, especially by identifying those cases where people can immediately stand to benefit.
Awesome, thank you. We've got about 10 more minutes in this panel, so I want to turn to the question I posed at the beginning, which is, we started to talk about, but what is it that's going to help motivate the next group of folks to adopt building electrification, high efficiency buildings, and help the state get to this place where we're confident that is going to be the future? We got a few great questions from our audience members that I'll use to spark this conversation a bit. I think this first one may be best for you, Nicola. It's a question of, are there any cross-agency PR efforts to educate customers about these opportunities? I'm especially curious also how there may be other benefits that get tied into that messaging beyond just the utility bill savings. So yeah, I'll turn to you and others can jump in as well.
Right. So as I mentioned, we work very closely with MEA on this effort. They recently issued an RFI for a vendor to perform electrification awareness outreach. And we're aligning our messaging together to make sure that customers are aware of the resources that are available to them to make those electrification upgrades affordable to them. Outside of that, we also have a monthly state agencies energy implementers group that works together to align programs and efforts across all state agencies, in which we've identified awareness and outreach one of the major needs, specifically not just for electrification, but for assistance that is available to lower energy bills and to help further the climate goals for the state. And through that group, we're going to continue to work together this year as well to develop awareness and outreach campaigns. I would encourage everybody to follow, social media of MEA, MDE, and DHCD, where we usually offer a lot of tips and advice and campaigns for consumers directly as well.
Awesome. Great. The next question I'll ask is about this question of moving to all electric new building and new construction codes. We know it costs a lot to do retrofits, and so it seems like it would be great to build all electric from the beginning. And David, I'll start with you, since you did mention how the state has adopted this policy for a lot of the buildings. Curious if you might be able to add a bit more on one, how that makes sense, and two, why we might not be there yet as a state. What barriers might be in the way that you think are most relevant? And again, I'll invite others to join if you.
Well, I guess fortunately and unfortunately, I deal with a very narrow population, which is other state agencies. So if you tell a state agency what to do, they will do it. Create a law, you draft an executive order and issue it. So we already have our marching orders in the state, which is, in Climate Solutions Now Act, it's in BEPS, it's in our High Performance Green Building Program. So we will get to that point if we are provided the funds necessary to get there. And I think the way we're doing it kind of makes sense, because we're trying to do it incrementally. We're looking at new buildings, we're looking at existing buildings. We have been, certainly since my tenure at DGS, have been holding quarterly meetings with university system, with MDOT, with all of our agencies that we support, initially discussing energy efficiency. Those conversations have now transitioned to energy efficiency plus electrification. So we are trying to educate our fellow state agencies on how to get this all done. We have now, every time that we draft a solicitation for decarbonization work or measurement and verification, we've made those also available for others to use. We're getting a lot of interest also from local government to use our decarbonization planning, our third-party consultant to look at BEPS reporting. So we're trying to throw as wide a net as possible, I guess.
Thank you. Rachel, I'll give you one last one, which is, you mentioned buildings are about 15% of the direct emissions in the state, plus electricity gets it pretty high. I think you said 93%? Yeah. Well, obviously, we're going to need steeper declines to stay on track for our climate plans, and we have some momentum, but we'll need some more. Curious what you see as driving the progress in the building electrification space over the coming years, of what you think needs to happen, especially from a policy perspective.
Well, I have an ask of all of you, is to please, please, please stay engaged with us in our many stakeholder engagement processes. I already told you, BEPS, due to a lot of legislative requirements, is undergoing a lot of review. We need more stakeholder engagement to help us evaluate potential new flexibilities to that program and to help us make sure we stay on track with our goal. You know that we're also exploring potential pathways on the clean heat standard and the zero emission heating equipment standard I just mentioned. Both of those need all of you to help participate in those discussions, to help us design and evaluate durable policy. Because policy can play a really helpful role when it gives the market some level of a certainty, right? When you're talking about massive capital intensive projects, building owners want to understand sort of where the market is moving, and that gives them the confidence to help move forward with those investments. So durable policy, which makes common sense, is really important. And there are many different diverse stakeholder groups we need to have present in those conversations, and you all are one of them. So please, please, please make sure that you're joining our BEPS advisory group meetings, which happen twice a month. They're ongoing. And we'll soon be releasing sort of some new stakeholder processes for our clean heat standard coming up in May. So I say that because durable policy, especially when, we're all facing so many concurrent challenges, economic challenges, federal headwinds, we need to be thinking smartly and sometimes thinking more out of the box and more innovatively about how to design policy that can help bring along not just those common sense solutions I talked about earlier, where the economic case is clear, but how we can be more creative at bringing on other private partners to help us get that next wave of adoption. And I think that will help us maintain momentum, despite, sometimes some of the challenges that we experience in the good but hard and important work of climate action.
Thank you for that. We'll stay tuned for those updates. With our last couple minutes here, I want to give just everyone a chance to have any last notes you'd like to share, of each having a minute or two to add anything else you'd like to speak to or think would be advice for folks that are following the space and advocating. That would be helpful. So yeah, Nicola, we'll go down to come back this way.
All right. Well, I think I wanted to speak a little bit more about the motivations for electrification. We know that there is still a lot of work to do in electrification and pushing it forward. Currently, the primary motivations are financial, of course. There's regulatory compliance, such as with BEPS. There are some prospects of operational savings for those who can factor that into their current cost effectiveness calculations. And then there's some risk mitigation as well. As we drive this effort forward, some of these motivations may shift over time. And I think even, in the future, there will be more sustainable and long-term motivations that will cause electrification and building efficiency and gas emissions reduction to stay. And those will be market expectations are already starting to shift, where high emissions, high performance and low emissions building are going to be expected to be the norm and not the exception anymore. As we're driving the efforts forward through BEPS and other standards, efficient buildings will be the standard and no longer the exception. The grid and technology improvements will ease some of the concerns of the general public about adoptability. And so I think overall, these market forces and the policy decisions made here in the state, they will continue to make electrification an economical choice in the long term.
So I thought it'd be worth for a minute just talking about this decarbonization plan that is just being completed now, because it does have a lot of interesting metrics associated with it, a lot of dollar signs. So bear with me for a minute. You might want to take some notes. First of all, this was for 17.5 million square feet of state-owned buildings. There's 28 standalone buildings and 28 campuses. And these campuses are master metered campuses, could be Department of Health, could be correctional facility, but they're very complex sets of buildings with very interesting uses, right? These are not typically office buildings. So this is probably just about the most complex set of buildings you can imagine. It's not all housing, it's not all office buildings, it's a whole variety of different types of buildings that the state owns. So if we look at the plan stretches out over the next 14 years, and we stepped this plan to look at initially 10 standalone buildings and then the balance of the standalone buildings, leaving the campuses for last, because frankly, we're probably going to need to catch up technologically to figure out how to electrify some of our campuses that currently either burn fuel oil or natural gas to produce steam that then gets distributed throughout the facility. So the costs at a 30-year life cycle, incremental cost of as little as, and I say as little as because I think it is, $133 million. And that would include the energy savings and not paying BEPS compliance fees. up to $446 million. And this is for the entire portfolio of buildings over the next 14 years. And so our solutions, include electric boilers, which are a very small number of projects that they've recommended, some geothermal, some air source heat pump, and a variable refrigerant flow called a VRF system. It's another type of a heat pump system, like a ductless heat pump. And utility savings, they're looking at about $10.5 million a year. The plan has the EUI reduced by 50% across the entire portfolio, which we didn't have an EUI in BEP, so we let them use an efficiency number that made sense for each project. So they just looked at what the cost effectiveness would be for each project. Alternatively, if we do nothing and we look at the state paying alternative compliance payments in BEPS, by 2040, if we do nothing, it's going to be about $125 million a year. So this is pretty good incentive for the state actually to start decarbonizing their buildings as soon as possible and get on with it.
Well, I think I already made my ask to you, but I would just note that, buildings continue to be such an important part of the work that we do at the agency, not only for their emissions profile, but again, because they're the heartbeat of where communities are, right? So when we think about what does it actually mean to take these big picture goals and translate them to specific actions, it's inviting all of us to tell the stories about where we've seen leaders making a difference, like thinking about some of those businesses that maybe already have adopted all electric buildings because it's more cost effective in some cases, or it's thinking about our neighbors who have had a positive story with heat pumps and are saving money on their electricity bills. Sometimes it's elevating those stories where we can see the progress that we're all trying to realize and helping people see that this big thing that sometimes feels so overwhelming can actually happen. And it happens all the time in places where we are. Even MDE's own efforts working with DGS to figure out how to do more with this building, which is an historic building, and thinking about what we can do in the spaces of influence that we have to help make this building less energy intensive, and contributing through some solar panels that we were able to put up on the back lot. So consider where your spheres of influence are and to lift up those stories where you see success happening, because that's what helps make it real for people and helps kind of help us continue that progress.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate all our panelists here. So I'll ask everyone to give them a round of applause. And all right, I'll turn it back to Laura as we move to the interactive part.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you very much to our panelists. Yes, so we are going to move into the interactive discussion piece for this afternoon. Ethan, if you can bring my slide up with some instructions. Essentially, we're going to have two parallel discussions for our beautiful hybrid meeting today. In the room, the wonderful GHHI team is passing out some worksheets. These are to help guide you in thinking through what we call 1, 2, 4, all. So we'll give you all about 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes, to individually reflect on our discussion questions, which are really about the priority opportunities that you see in front of you based on the panel conversations we've had today and your own experience and perspective. So we want you to identify a key priority that matters to you, and just describe a little bit about why that particularly matters. What could be made possible if we were to make this a priority in 2026? So in this first column, please just jot a few thoughts down, reflecting on these questions. After about 10 minutes, we'll invite you to find a partner. We'll do a little paired discussion where we ask you to share what you were reflecting on and think about what are some of the similarities, some of the overlapping characteristics, some of the common needs for the priorities that you've identified. After another about 5 minutes of pair discussion, we're going to invite you to find another pair. So your 2 will become 4. And we'll give everybody about 15 minutes to, in a small group discussion, take a look at the questions in that third column, really thinking about what's needed to make these priorities a reality and what expertise, what resources are already in the room today in order to make that a possibility. So thank you very much again to the GHHI team for handing out worksheets. We are going to be collecting these at the end of the day to help Maryland Climate Partners better understand what opportunities we might be advocating for and what other types of convenings, events, resources we might be able to provide. Online, our discussion questions will be via Slido. So our Zoom participants will be following along in their browser to answer a parallel set of questions about what really stands out as important to you. I will be sure to give you all some timing reminders and help you follow along in the discussion. But for now, I'm going to invite you to take about 5 minutes to think individually, reflect on those questions in the first column, and really begin to digest what you've heard today. Any questions from our in the room audience on what we're doing in this interactive discussion? Great. No questions. If you have any, feel free to reach out, speak up, raise a hand, and a Climate Partners member will help you out. All right. Enjoy your individual reflection time.
how we all creatively, videos, social media, etc., like talk to people about heat pumps and electrification and figure out the social language, like, because heat pumps and electrification cannot possibly be the way that we actually end up marketing this well. So how are we going to figure out a way to get everyone excited about this?
My steps in. So I would build on that it's not just about getting people excited about heat pumps, it's getting heat pump owners excited about knowing how to operate them so that they don't give you $900 bills in the winter, and to educate contractors. So looking for opportunities for both that heat pump owner and installer education so they're optimized and least cost energy bill option.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. Appreciate that tag team build up for this question. I think you're touching on something that, especially I know the team at the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, which has helped to get heat pumps into many homes, know that that's a big challenge to overcome, the education on this new type of technology. Looks like Ruth Alice has our next takeaway.
Well, just following up on that, we said educating heat pump installers too, and their workers. We also talked about, we were so impressed with what the General Services Office is doing to electrify buildings in Maryland. And they need, with more money, they could do more on that. They're saying that they're limited by their funding. We also talked a lot about also funding for homeowners to electrify, and we don't know where all this money is coming from because that was a big issue this year. We want to see all electric new buildings, and we know that that legislation didn't go anywhere this year. A step forward would be, if that can't pass, although we'd like to see it pass, is to require all new homes be electric ready, which is a step that there's a ring here. Am I holding it wrong?
Yeah, maybe the output.
Is this better? Okay. Also green banks to help fund some of these projects, and simple ads, homeowner to homeowner, housewife to housewife, about the value of heat pumps and power. Just getting that information out there. Coaching for having the state provide coaching like Montgomery County does for home electrification, having that be statewide.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruth Alice. And it looks like we have another takeaway in the back right, or stage left corner. I definitely hearing a consistent theme, and I think it's not surprising to folks in this room that advocacy for these new technologies, education about how they are properly function, and funding to ensure that we can deploy these technologies, which we know have tremendous benefits and multiple co-benefits, is a consistent theme that I'm not surprised we're hearing. Go ahead.
So we had a different topic besides heat pumps and what's really interesting is that everyone in our group pretty much independently kind of landed on the same thing, which is transit and transportation. It was wild, but in any case, we see that, transportation is a huge, has a huge greenhouse gas impact and climate impact. But not only that, but it's really important in terms of people getting to work and supporting a workforce. And I know that in certain communities, maybe even across the state, except for maybe in the DC area, it's really hard for people to get around without a car. And so we want to see green, efficient transportation. We want it to be accessible to folks, and especially in low-income communities who don't have access to their own transportation. We want to see partnerships across the different agencies that need to work together to be able to make this happen. And we'd also Are we supposed to go into like the synthesis? at This point? Yes? No? Okay, well, that's enough. Transportation.
This is the largest source of emissions. Yay. Well, I'm gonna, my answer is actually something that was alluded to a little bit on the panel, on one of the panels, but about offshore wind energy. I know that Megan Conklin mentioned it briefly, and sort of with the federal headwinds, it's difficult to work. Yeah, see, thank you. That it's been a difficult journey for offshore wind, but we have a fully permitted project ready to go off the coast of Maryland that's set to deliver 1.7 gigawatts. It's a lot of energy. I didn't know what a gigawatt was when I started working on wind, but it's a lot, more than 500,000 homes. And so there's a lot of advocacy to do, and a lot of organizing in Ocean City where there's a lot of entrenched opposition to wind. That's mostly based in mis and disinformation. So there's a lot to do around bringing clean energy from wind off the coast of Maryland to people's homes. And wind performed really well this winter. And so Virginia can have it, but we can't. Like, let's get more wind in Maryland. So there's a lot to do there. Maryland LCU works closely with the Offshore Wind Alliance on these issues, and so if you want to learn more, check us out. We're going to have a webinar on June 4th, just ahead of Global Wind Day, which is June 15th, and we're going to work with Turn Forward to release there's new polling showing how much support there is for offshore wind. So that's what I'm excited about.
And while Rebecca's walking that microphone, I'll just flag, I know I've heard folks talking about something that hasn't been a major focus, but I'd be really curious to hear from anybody who might have been thinking about health implications, health impacts, and those co-benefits. Go for it.
Hi. One thing I'm not excited about is the lack of support within the PSC for, and I'm not excited that the utility relief bill included messing around with net metering for solar. It's wonderful to hear all the people on the panel say that solar is amazing, solar's going to get this and solar's going to get that, and it's the best and the cheapest. So it's extremely disappointing that in the recent Utility Relief Act, they are messing around with our Maryland net metering, which is kind of a cornerstone of having a strong solar industry. So I hope that there's some room that we can all advocate to continue to have strong net metering in Maryland. So one thing I am excited about is the public uprising and the public knowledge about data centers, and just the way people you wouldn't even think of as activists are coming together out in Western Maryland, out in other states that you would never think would come and do any kind of political stuff, are really learning about data centers and what a threat that they are to our rates that we're all paying, and also to our environment. And so I'm kind of excited about that there is this upswell of knowledge and people fighting against these unfair policies that the data centers are bringing us.
You want to do like one more?
I think we have time for one more report back if anybody wants to take the bait.
Yeah.
Nadia in the back. Thank you.
Nadia knows I'm short on steps today, so.
Okay. Oh, wow. This is loud. Hi, everyone. Our group talked a bit about the need to make sure that other state agencies are here, in particular, the Maryland Department of Health, the Maryland Department of Transportation, Agriculture, Natural Resources, but also just to make sure that there's funding to support all of these staff agencies, because we definitely need more staff support from the state level side to actually be able to kind of bring everything into fruition. And then we also talked about the excitement about the growing need and opportunity for public power, and just the need to have utility rate payers have more agency and control over the rates that we pay.
Hey, Laura, did that sound like
in the series of agencies forums that we're doing, one in December that was virtual, this one that was hybrid, that maybe there'll be another webinar in the series where we have health, transportation, natural resources, and agriculture. Would folks be interested in that? All right.
Wonderful.
Listening to public participation in real time. Who, I just gotta know, and Laura's gonna be mad at me because I'm taking up too much time. Who found it meaningful to be here in person today? That's really helpful for us to know as we plan these events. As we know, there was some technical difficulties in the morning. It's not, the hybrid. We're doing our best, and it's very helpful to know how meaningful it was to everyone who stuck around to the end. That it was that there was purpose and meaning to having those in-person interactions. So that's super helpful. When Laura sends you all a survey, please make sure to put some comments. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And thank you for that transition, because I think we'll go to our next step slide. And absolutely, as Rebecca was saying, one of the main takeaways for Maryland Climate Partners coming out of this event is really taking the ideas, the questions that you all wrote on index cards and in the Zoom Q&A, the ideas that you shared on your worksheets that we will ask to collect back so we can review. We are taking all of the information, the questions, the input that you all are sharing today to inform our future series of events, to continue having these conversations about what is possible, what is needed, and what we can all do in collaboration to continue to advance our climate goals within the state of Maryland. So again, like Rebecca said, thank you all so very, very much for being here in person. And for those of you who stuck with us through our technical difficulties with the hybrid meeting, there's been a lot of feedback, a lot of ideas shared that we're really, really excited to move forward in the remainder of 2026. So up on the slide, we have a QR code for a survey for feedback, for some additional feedback that should take you less than 10 minutes to complete. We will also share the feedback survey over email. So if you can't snap a quick pic or you'd rather see that link in your email, that's a-okay. Again, we are going to be using all of the feedback you've shared, the ideas you've generated, so we'd appreciate if you could return your worksheets. There is a wicker basket on the registration table where we're going to ask that you return that information. We'll also be using all of the notes that we've been taking, the recording, the slides, and we will share that out in a summary report out to help you all engage, remember, remind yourselves of what took place today. We're looking forward to staying engaged with you all as we continue to work throughout 2026 to advance our climate priorities, and we hope to see you in another conversation soon. And last but not least, for my in-person attendees, we have leftover lunches. If anybody wants to take a meal home, feel free to do so. But once again, thank you all so very much for being here today. Really appreciate all of your ideas and participation.